Good day, folks, and welcome to the stream wherever you may be around the world. And my deepest apologies because it's late. I was having internet issues, which took me some time to fix. However, they are now fixed and the stream is starting. However, I'm not sure how many guests I'm going to get on because everyone thinks the stream wasn't going to go. So we'll see. I've sent links to everybody who was going to come on, and we'll see what happens, I guess. As always, I shall start us off with a bit of a tune. I'm sorry, guys. Like I said, my internet just wasn't working, and it took me like 20 minutes to get it fixed. So apologies. All right, we're going to start us off with a tune, I guess. Boom.
Once a jolly swagman camped by a villain under and made it below thee. Won't sing Matilda, won't sing Matilda, you'll come a won't sing Matilda with me. And he sang as he watched and made it below. You'll come a won't sing Matilda with me. Down came a jump back to ring at the billabong. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him with glee. And he sang as he stole that jump back in his tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with thee. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with thee. And he sang as he stole that jump back in his tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Once a jolly swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy was. You'll come a waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy was. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Down came a jump back to ring at the billabong. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him with glee. And he sang as he stole that jump back in his tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with thee. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come waltzing Matilda with me. And he sang as he stole that jump back in his tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.
Okay, so that was obviously Wars in Matilda from some World War II Aussie diggers. I'm sorry, guys, this stream is late. Not entirely my fault, but mostly my fault. It was just an internet issue, which I've only just managed to fix. And unfortunately, I think most of the guests that were going to join me didn't think I was going to fix it, or I didn't get back to them quickly enough. But anyway, I have sent links to all of them, and we will see if any of them actually show up. If they don't, this will be a disaster of a stream. But there we go. I did actually have a liquid lunch myself today, but we'll see what goes on. You'll have to forgive me as I check. Good. All right. Furious tells me he'll be around in 2 minutes. I have also sent the link to Chris Gard, who was my main guest. But yeah, like I said, my bloody fault. Hopefully we're going to get Furious Budnax and Chris Gard in due course. I did actually tell people on my Discord earlier, one of my very, very kind Australian mates got my dog a new squeaky toy. It's a squeaky kangaroo. And in case you wanted to hear what I have been hearing for quite a lot of today is this. So yeah, the Australians are very kind people when they get your cross-track Russells toys like that. Although my dog is not getting that back until after the stream. So there we go. But there we go. And he's looking at me at the moment as if to say, you want a squeaky game, do you? So there we go. Yeah, I know Chris was in the chat earlier, Sonny Jim. Like I said, my internet just was not working properly, and it took me about 20 minutes to work out what the issue was, which I still really don't know, but it's working. So, there you go. So anyway, happy Australia Day to everybody. And this is it's not going to be a heavy political stream or anything like that, I hope. It's going to be just people talking, and naturally enough, you don't expect most Australians to be totally sober at 6 p.m. on Australia Day, because we've all been to see family and friends and all this kind of stuff. What's going on here? Trust me to manage to bugger up something I've been working on for ages. But what can you do? Yeah, I guess so. Come on, chap. Ask me some questions. I'll see if I can answer them for you. Bilboa says sobriety at this hour should be an ASIO check. Yeah, if ASIO was in any way, shape, or form pro-Australian, I'd probably agree with that. Nice to see Mr. Gently Benevolent in the chat. He's a good chap. Sonny Jim, often around. Who else have we got? Judge Matty is another dude that I've often seen in our chat. So hello to you, sir. Yeah. I had a liquid lunch for a couple of my mates, and that's when I ended up getting the new squeaky kangaroo to go with my dog's squeaky monkey and squeaky horse. Boy, oh boy, was I thrilled to get that as an Australia Day present. My little dog is now sitting under my seat. But anyway, Tomb of Arminius. Did you see the Australians of the Year? Tomb of Arminius, no, I didn't, because I don't watch the mainstream media. But if you want to tell me who they are, we can certainly discuss them. And no, I haven't gone through the military honours list. I'm not sure what military honours Australia is going to give out at the moment. There were some good special forces dudes who did quite a lot of stuff in Afghanistan and what have you. But Australia wouldn't send the infantry. And I happen to know quite a few Australian dudes who served in the infantry who were quite frustrated about that. But on the other hand, it was a complete waste of time for everyone who did go there because we pulled out. So what was the point of it? They have, so it's Tomb of Arminius, 5 order OAMs and CSMs, etc. Okay. Peacetime awards. Yeah. Well, I'm in favor of peacetime, generally speaking, as an old soldier, rather than a bold soldier. But I don't know, guys. Look, the governments we have at the moment, including down under, are not in favor of the real people of those countries. So what can I say? Oh, here we go. Come on, this will be good. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there he is. Furious, how are you going, mate?
Good afternoon, sir. Sorry, that slight delay. Like I said in the Discord, for some reason every so often I have to restart my computer because my drivers, like my microphone, plays up. So anyway, here we
Not
are.
a problem, mate. Not a problem. It was entirely my fault. My internet just wasn't working for like 20 minutes, and I couldn't work out. So I had to do a total restart, and then I had to actually restart my wonderful Telstra piece of equipment and wait 5 minutes and all this wonderful stuff that one does in Australia. So yeah, I'm really sorry. It was my fault. I've sent Chris Gard a link in the Discord, but I don't know if he's seen it, because he did say to me, I'm going to party on with my mates, because he thought I wasn't starting. So I don't know.
Yeah,
if you have another way, of getting hold of him.
I just sent him a DM on Twitter, so hopefully he sees it.
Thank you very much, sir.
In the meantime,
I've wanted to have you on a stream for ages, Furious. You're one of my 3 favorite Australian content creators. The others being Chris and, of course, the wonderful Franklin. Yeah, I'm really happy to have you on here, mate. How are you going?
No, indeed, it's been good to chat. I know, there are obviously times we've popped up in the chat. Whether it's been with Apostolic Majesty or whether I've been with Prude or Mr. Patriarch or something. And I know you always pop up and always have a nice word to say, or if I get something wrong, you usually sort of correct me. Particularly when we did the Napoleonic streams, there were little details that I sometimes got hazy about. And I was like, oh, Iron Duke will know the answer to that. Getting Plassinois and Hougoumont confused or something like that, and it's like, I know Iron Duke will set me straight. So I always look forward to your participation. Indeed, I know we've been sort of meaning to get in touch with each other, we haven't. So it's definitely fantastic that we have, because it's been well overdue. But they say better late than never, right?
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Look, you're one of the few people I consider a military historian on our part of the right wing, dissident right, sensible centrists, whatever you want to call us. So yeah, I'm very happy to have you on, Emma. We must do some history stuff together at some point, because that would be cool.
That would be wonderful. Yes, like you say, there's not too many amongst us, in our sort of sphere who actually sort of cover. I mean, for me, I have other aspects of history that I do enjoy, but military history is sort of a bread and butter thing. And I think with yourself having served in the forces and you have a deep understanding of some of these principles, it's actually nice to sort of speak to someone who is I mean, I've never worn a uniform myself, but for someone who's at least a peer on that plane, it's very rare, and it's a very enjoyable subject, as you well know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And look, one of the reasons I like you is because you know your stuff about ancient Rome and all that kind of stuff. And my dad got me into ancient Rome when I was about 8 years old. He bought me a book about Julius Caesar. So, and as you probably know, once you get into Julius Caesar, you kind of get into ancient Rome, and
there's no going back.
Yeah, it's that's one of the bases of like Western civilization, as far as I'm concerned, anyway.
Indeed, I think it goes without saying that probably Julius Caesar, if you have to consider sort of who was sort of 5 or 6 of the most transformative individuals in history, I think it would be almost impossible to not have Julius Caesar in that list, amongst a few other people, of course.
Oh yeah, like Alexander, obviously, and yeah, absolutely, I agree.
Constantine,
with that.
And it grates me to say it, but it's probably hard to say Muhammad as well. Like just if you think about the after effects of the lives of these people and the reverberations thereafter. I mean, they're tremendous. You got to think, even for our standpoint as being Westerners, and I'm not too sure. I assume that you're a Christian of some denomination, but
I'm a cultural Christian, because
okay,
I'm an agnostic, to be honest.
Okay, fair enough. But in the sense insofar that so much of our Western identity is tied up in sort of degrees of Christianity or expressions of Christianity, whether you're Greek Orthodox or you're Russian Orthodox or you're Roman Catholic or Protestant or Church of England or whatever it is, that none of that happens without Constantine. Like you just get these figures who pop up and they're massively transformative.
Oh yeah, 100% correct. But what I find is, like, I really like Apostolic Majesty, or I hope will come back to streaming fairly soon. And he says he's a brilliant dude who just remembers so much stuff. It's incredible.
Oh yes, he's magnificent.
But he says himself,
it's a privilege to work with him.
Oh yeah, he's a great guy, and I'm a model on his channel. I'm a model on 2 channels. It's him and Dave the distributor. It's nobody else. But he even says himself he doesn't particularly like the military aspects of history, which is good that he has you on, who that's one of the things that you're into. So because you do have to understand the military aspects of history if you're going to talk about it, because so much history is made by those who won and those who didn't win. And it was very often not the ordinary soldiers. It was very often the generals who made the mistakes, So the soldiers just do the best with the orders they're given for the most part.
Or even, for instance, say there are examples of this, say with Alexander's campaigns or with Caesar's, there's the particular initiative of officers or sub-commanders who transform a battle. I mean, just two examples that briefly come to mind is, say, I think it was Granicus, where sort of poor Parmenion is sort of left to sort of hold the Greek left and center, while sort of Alexander was gallivanting with his companions and rolling up the Persian flank. Alexander's maneuver wouldn't have worked if Parmenion had not gallantly held the phalangity in place. The
dude in the middle. Yeah, the dude in the middle. Absolutely. Yeah, he had to. I don't know what you think about the film that what's his name made. The bloke who did the
Colin Farrell.
Yeah, Colin Farrell was the star. I can't remember who the director was now, but he's done big interviews with people like Putin and all this kind of stuff.
Oliver Stone.
Yeah, Oliver Stone. I think that film is good, but I find the gay stuff in it a bit off-putting. Let me say.
Hollywood being Hollywood, though, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure
how
accurate that is. We don't really know.
Yeah. The thing is that's why I'm sort of in a way glad that any coverage of Julius Caesar has usually been done in sort of like a mini-series standpoint, whether it's been HBO's Rome, whether it's the BBC. They've done, I think, at least 1 or 2 productions of Caesar, you know, sort of in an episodic form. But I'm actually kind of relieved in a sense that Hollywood hasn't actually ventured towards Julius Caesar per se. I mean, I know there's that one, that famous example of that, shall I say, that diversity hire remake of Julius Caesar that BBC did. But that is an exception. I'm kind of glad that Hollywood hasn't sort of smeared Caesar by some false representation of him in a sort of a dramatic production.
Well, the BBC actually had Achilles played by a black bloke.
Oh, they've done the same. They've done it with everyone. They've done it with you know, Sir Lancelot, and with you know, you know, the Knights of the Round Table, and they've done it with is it I'm trying to think the mother of Richard Lionheart, of Eleanor of Aquitaine. You know, just in the end, we almost expect it now. Like, it's just sort of like this sort of impending sense of doom that our history will be debased by those in charge, right?
Yeah, I've got to the stage where, like, if any Western TV or Hollywood or what have you is doing a film, I don't want them to do it because I just know what they're going to do now.
Exactly, which is why I think for any of us, I mean, there's always the classical kind of things that were done in the past. You know, you have those productions such as, and I mean, we've spoken about them, particularly say on AM's channel, and sometimes when we've spoken about movies with Academic Agent, you know, there's sort of those old movies of say, and I mean, again, as an example, I did that review with Mr. Prudentialist and Geo, which we haven't actually finished our review of Ben-Hur yet, but those old sort of classics, you know, Ben-Hur, Spartacus, Quo Vadis, you know, there's a whole bunch of those old movies which were sort of done fairly authentically with modern technology.
They weren't bad. They weren't bad. Yes,
they weren't bad. And then you sort of had this slight resurgence of the historical epic in the sort of late 90s and early 2000s, which you could probably argue was sort of triggered by Braveheart, and then a few years later Gladiator as well became these huge blockbuster movies, which I think by and large are actually quite honest depictions of the time that they're trying to represent, even though there's sort of certain historical, you know, facts that are embellished or they just get wrong. You know, like I always laugh with Braveheart how the Battle of Stirling doesn't actually contain a bridge, because it is actually the Battle of Stirling Bridge.
I used to live in Stirling for a while. And like where the huge monument is to what's his name? The guy who the Aussie bloke played in the film, which was complete crap, of course. But yeah, but I used to live in Stirling, and there was another place. If you went to, where was it? I'm trying to think now. A little bit up the road from there was a big monument to the Scottish King.
Robert the Bruce.
Yeah. There's a big equestrian statue of Robert the Bruce with his battle axe and all this kind of stuff, which was cool. I used to, I like that stuff, even though I'm a Sassenach. I used to like that stuff.
Yeah.
And there's this huge tower at, which is about, what's his name? The dude who what was he called now? I can't remember his name. But the Scottish bloke who was supposedly fighting for our freedom.
Oh, William Wallace.
Yeah, William Wallace. The William Wallace Memorial is huge. And on it is a big sword, which repeatedly got stolen by Scottish people who climbed up there and stole the big sword. It was really quite funny.
You can't part a Scotsman from his claymore, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the idea that back then they were wearing tartans and stuff is just nonsense, because they were. And also, like, yeah, but no, they just weren't. And also, you know, the Lowland Scots were actually more, how shall I put it? They were more related to the Northern English than they were to the Highland Scots.
Yeah, I don't actually find that surprising. You know, it's interesting when you look at maps, because I do love, there's a couple of channels I do like on YouTube, you know, separate from our spheres, and one of them is I think there's a cluster of three of them. I'm just trying to think of their names. There's History Time, there's Lost Voices of History, and a third channel that I always seem to forget. I always forget like one of the three, and I just can't think of the third one at the moment. But one of them actually canvasses, well, there's sort of two-part video. One is sort of Britain before Rome, and then Rome and Britain is episode 2, and then there's technically part 3, which is sort of Britain after Rome, which sort of talks about the invasion of the Angles and Saxons and Jutes, and then these embryonic sort of Anglo kingdoms, Anglo-British kingdoms, and then of course the arrival of the Vikings, with the Danelaw and the establishment of essentially the Danelaw state upon England, which was there for a couple of centuries. And these streams are actually quite magnificent. What's interesting about it is you sort of look at those maps, and we sort of look nowadays is at the sort of terminus of northern England, which I would presume is sort of like Northumbria, sort of up there. Actually, in sort of pre-medieval times or even pre-modern times, sort of what was considered England actually stretched a bit further north, as you say, like almost into the lowlands, sort of almost into that sort of a Stirling, Perth, as in Perth, Scotland, those sort of southern environs of Scotland, which are now part of Scotland. Indeed, for a long time, they were considered more English, or at least had a shared English-Scottish identity.
Yeah, if you look at the 1745 rebellion and this sort of stuff, like most of the Lowland Scots were pro-British. So,
And this is the thing too. I mean, I suppose to sort of perhaps wind it a little bit to the topic of the stream, which is Australia Day, is that the Scots, the Irish, the English, which you could sort of all consider Brythonic people, or Britons, I suppose is the right word to use.
Anglo-Celts is what I always say.
Yeah, Anglo-Celts is probably a really accurate word to use. Is the founding stock of many of the New World countries, particularly those we sort of consider part of the Commonwealth and of the Anglosphere. That's the founding stock of Canada, with the exception of obviously French Canada and Quebec or Nouvelle France, that sort of thing. They're the founding stock of New England in the 13 states in the United States of America. They're the founding stock of New Zealand and Australia. And what we sort of have is these many examples of Britannia in absentia, Britannia beyond the seas. Which
100% agree with that.
And as someone who obviously am of different stock, being a med, in many ways I've considered myself very lucky to have been born in the Anglosphere in Australia. And there's a great amount of I know often, as we say in Australia, skips and wogs tend to sort of lock horns with each other, or tend to sort of berate one another and engage in banter.
I've seen some stuff in the chat talking about you being a wog, which I don't like, to be honest.
I honestly think it's hilarious.
Although I had a mate in England. I had a mate in England many years ago in the British Army who was an Italian Englishman and had joined the British Army. And he said, how can you tell Italian spaghetti? This was his joke. And he said,
you told me this last stream and I've already forgotten it. Oh, no.
Yeah. How can you tell Italian spaghetti? And he said, because when you throw it up against the wall, it goes, whop!
That's right. So, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Whop. But he was an Italian and he could do that joke, and I never would. And actually, I thought he was a damn good bloke. And we used to drink together and chase skirt together. So, I got no problem with any of that stuff. And like I said, without Italy and Rome, where would the West be? We wouldn't be anywhere, basically.
Yeah, Europe would be rather different. And the thing is that just to sort of go back to the point I had started, was that we might joke about things, or we might engage in bands, or sort of, they even in some instances might be, genuine animosity for God knows why. But in the end, what there is actually is a shared European identity and sort of like our ethnos are different, but they are related, or to some degree interrelated, because of the proximity of our people over the course of centuries and millennia. But put it this way, an Englishman and an Italian, or an Englishman and a Frenchman, heavens forbid, or a Frenchman and an Italian, have far more in common than what we do with, say, a Japanese person, or what we would do with a person from Burma or the Philippines, or from or from
Yeah.
Mongolia, or from,
Yeah.
dare I say, native Australians or native Maoris. There's actually this sort of like a shared identity that comes with being sort of from that part of the world, as we are as Europeans. And and I think that is something that ought to be sort of treasured, particularly as, to quote AA, we are a generation, or a cluster of generations, who are going to walk through the ashes. It's better to appreciate and value the things that we share, rather than sort of, in a very petty manner, highlight our small differences.
Yeah. Yep. I used to have a friend. I moved a few years ago, so I'm now a long way out of Melbourne. But I used to live in South Melbourne, in the middle of the city, and I had a friend who was a little old lady who had a lovely Staffordshire Terrier dog. And that's how we became friends, because I like all dogs and a fair number of people. And when I went to the supermarket, I'd get her dogs some treats or something. And she was a devout Roman Catholic, and she goes to Italy quite often, mainly to go to Rome and to see the Pope and all this kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
So when she came back last time, she got me 2 presents, which I was really amazed at and really cool. And one of them, yeah, no, she was a lovely, lovely lady, and she's an Aussie lady, obviously. And she got me a beautiful thing for my keyring with the with the Colosseum on it. The what's it called? I'm trying to remember now. What's the right name for it?
The Flavian Amphitheatre.
Yeah, the Flavian Amphitheatre.
Yeah,
that's on my keyring. And she also got me this lovely little fridge magnet with a dog on duty, guard dog here thing from Pompeii. So I was really happy about that, because we both had dogs, and that's how we became friends. But yeah, absolutely. And the Romans used to have this stuff saying, "Beware of the dog." And because I've got a little cross Jack Russell on my door, I have a "Beware of the dog" sign, which is kind of a joke, because my Jack Russell is not very small, not very big, but he is fierce.
Well, that's the old adage, right? About it's never the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog.
100%.
And many of those people like that. People sort of think, "Oh, little sausage dogs, they're cute," but actually, sausage dogs are in fact bred for fearlessness because of the badger hunting. Little Jack Russells and Terriers, they are actually bred because they're so small. They're very attuned to.
They used to get put down
motion.
They used to get put down into the earth to go and fight
rabbit warrens and stuff. Yeah. And so they're actually very gutsy and brave dogs, and particularly if they're protecting their owner or their master. I remember seeing something, because there's always those things that circulate Twitter or Facebook or whatever. And there was one little Scottish Terrier pup who I think was protecting a baby from a family, and engaged a poisonous snake and actually killed the snake, but it suffered so many bites that it died soon afterwards. But yeah, that's just their nature, and I mean, that's what I think. To touch on sort of another European thing, this is why I think our ilk do actually have a special relationship with dogs. I think it's, you look at the historical sort of trajectory of humans and the animals we've domesticated, and there's obviously this process, in the so-called Fertile Crescent, what we sort of consider modern day Iraq and Syria and the Levant, what we historically call the Fertile Crescent. There's obviously this process where once we started building sort of settlements and we started engaging in farming and domestication, we domesticated oxen and cattle and donkeys and mules and horses, etc., etc., etc. And one of the things that we first happened to domesticate was dogs. And yet, there are many societies even nowadays that sort of are not particularly predisposed to having dogs as a part of a family or engaging in companionship with people. But for us, it's a story literally as old as time. When you think that there are Roman mosaics that have men carrying pups, or women feeding their dogs at the table, or there's an epithet of I think there's a Roman tomb somewhere in southern Tuscany, or somewhere in Tuscany somewhere, which was the Roman province of Etruria. And it's sort of it's a very sad thing to say actually, but it's sort of like this little mosaic, and the epithet says, um, I carried you with my arms 15 years ago, with such joy, and 15 years later I put you to rest, and I cannot stop weeping. And that mosaic is the better part of 2,000 years old. So what does that say to the relationship that we have with them?
That's every person today. I mean, like the bad thing about dogs is they don't live long enough.
Nowhere near long enough. That is so true. In fact, my family we lost our dog start of the year as well, and it does. Once you lose them, they leave a little hole in your heart that you never fill. In fact, I actually grew up with a Kelpie, a sheepdog, and what's interesting is that I was born, the year I was born, because I'm in my mid-30s, and basically the week after I came home, like within the same month, we actually got a new sheepdog because our previous sheepdogs had both died the year before. So I actually literally grew up with this dog, and he now passed away, would have been 20 years ago now. I still miss him. Like I still kind of ponder. It's like, oh, what would I do if I had him here? Like I think you never actually lose that if you're a person of that kind of disposition,
Yeah, you don't. Look, my dad, my granddad, I beg your pardon, who was a soldier in India in between the wars. Like he joined up again in 1940 because the Luftwaffe flattened his place in London. Luckily, everybody was in an air raid shelter, so nobody died. But the only thing they got out of it was a flat iron, which was like a big iron you put on a stove to heat up to do your ironing. And then he got given a job because he'd been a bus driver for London Transport. They gave him this great job in Kent, where he basically just trained British dudes to drive, because modern armies need people to be able to drive, and he hated it. And he kept asking for a transfer, and they wouldn't give him one, and they wouldn't give him one. And eventually they did. And so on D+3, he went across to Normandy. And this is one of the things I sometimes, I get annoyed at people on the right. Like my granddad was like an absolute British patriot. He wasn't particularly anti-German or anything. It was just like, if you're going to flatten my house and you're going to fight us, I'm going to fight you. Because his granddad sort of obviously been in the British Army in World War I. But he was in no way particularly anti-German or anything. But, he was a soldier, and that's what most of my family are cannon fodder, And so, he thought, don't like this. Don't want to be in Kent training people to drive. I want to go and fight people. So, like I said, D+3 eventually went across. And like in Belgium, he had to shut down brothels that were ripping off British soldiers because, where there's loads of soldiers, there's going to be brothels.
Of course.
All this kind of stuff. But they were ripping them off. And he said, can't go there. Go somewhere else. Whatever. But I don't get the stuff that people don't understand this kind of basic shit. And Australia, obviously, in World War II was exactly the same, except you have to say about Australia that in World War II, it was Australian diggers who first beat the Germans on land at Tobruk, and later first beat the Japanese on land in New Guinea, and they did. So I'm not going to talk about the politics because it doesn't really matter to me. But the soldiers were good blokes,
Well, this is the thing too.
I did say diggers, dark helmet. Yes, I did. Diggers. Digger is what you call an Australian military man.
Indeed, and you're quite right, and this is why, you know, if you consider the kind of adversaries they faced in actually either the world wars, because I think we spoke about this when we were on with Semigog about sort of like the toughness and the resourcefulness and the you know, the gallantry demonstrated by the average Australian digger or soldier, you know, was exemplary, and this is why, you know, German generals, you know, from World War One, you sort of hear talk, you know, when the Canadians and the Australians break the Hindenburg Line, in the aftermath of Villers-Bretonneux, and also the Turks at Gallipoli say the same thing. And most famously, as a field marshal, Rommel commented on the Australians at Tobruk. And I mean, I would know myself because I remember my grandfather fought in the North African campaign, and he was present at the Battle of Tobruk, and he sort of used to always, with a wry smile, comment about how the Australians are some of the toughest bastards he had ever sort of come up against, you know, and it's true.
And your grandfather would have been an Italian soldier back then, yeah?
Yeah, he fought in the 131st Italian Armored Division.
Which were, and look, let's get another thing straight. The Italian army gets a very bad rep in World War II, which is not deserved, because the Italians sometimes fought very bravely. Like people like the Pescalleri and some of the Italian armored divisions were actually very good soldiers. They didn't always have the best
and the
equipment.
airborne troops as well.
Yep, for sure. But the Italians didn't always have the best equipment, but like the soldiers themselves, or if you talk to people who actually fought them, and I have, because I know quite a lot of, I used to know quite a lot of World War II veterans from
sadly,
from the Middle East.
Sadly, not many of those men are left with us. Sadly,
Exactly right. Mate, I was born in 1965, so I'm an old bastard. But I knew quite a lot of blokes who fought in World War II in North Africa. And like, if you spoke to them about the Italians, they would say, like, they varied. There were really good units, there were not so good units. Pretty much like any other army, really.
Exactly, and also a lot of it depended too on supply, because one of the great weaknesses of the Italian army was its logistics organization. It was very much lacking, say, even compared to the Germans. Never mind, you know, in comparison to, say, the British and the Americans, which, you know, by sort of 43, 44, the Allies had developed a very, very you know, sophisticated logistics network. And I actually, just to quote military theorists, because he's right, yeah, the Italian Folgore division, that's when I was referencing the Italian paratroopers. See, they actually held the bottom part of the front, like at the Battle of El Alamein. The south, the Folgore was basically the center pin of the southern part of the front, and they were attacked by about 4 Allied divisions, one of them armored, and the Folgore threw every single attack back and only pulled back from the line when they had
The
exhausted their
Italians
ammunition.
in World War II, like some of their soldiers and much of the Italian Navy are actually really, really good.
Yeah, and many good vehicles too. I mean, you'd know this again, Andrew, because of the fact that you've studied this. Is that you look at Italian ships? A number of their ships are very good, particularly like the later battleships and the heavy cruisers. And
for
some Italian
sure,
destroyers
absolutely.
were good. And their planes were excellent. Arguably, if you're talking pound for pound in terms of performance v cost v numbers actually fielded, you know, the Italian, you know, the Fiat G55 and the Veltro, the Marchetti Veltro. Amongst other planes that the Italians built were fantastic planes, arguably better than the Messerschmitts, arguably better than the Focke-Wulf, arguably better than the Spitfires.
The later
them.
Italian fighter aircraft were probably they were at least as good as the 109 or the Spitfire.
Absolutely.
Earlier on, you had Italians in less good aircraft. Actually fighting very bravely against blokes with I mean, at one stage in North Africa, you had the British fighting in Gladiator biplanes against the Italians in what was it, CA-42 biplanes.
That's right, yeah.
So it was almost like World War I at one stage.
Yeah.
But I wish the Italians and the Brits weren't fighting in the first place, to be honest.
Don't we all think that? And what's interesting, just because I know Franklin's joined, we should say hello. But just to end this point very quickly, this was actually the one thing I noticed when I used to go to like Remembrance Days, or because my grandfather used to be invited along with his like Italian compatriots, because we were in a small country town. They used to say, "Oh, listen, come along and join us. It doesn't matter, your side, our side. The war's long gone. It doesn't matter." And just watching the Italians and the Aussies mingle with each other and laugh, joke and tell stories, and sometimes have a tear in their eye, you sort of think to yourselves, it's that whole like, oh, no more brother wars thing, and it's really like that. The fact that we had fought each other, and even to some degree quarreling with the Germans, for half a century, was just, when you think about what's happened to the world since, it's all been quite pointless in the end, and it's a seminal tragedy for European civilization. All
100%, man, 100%. But I must welcome one of my favorite Australian content creators, the Franklin. Oh man, I'm so happy to have you on the stream at last. How you going, man?
I'm okay. Yeah, I managed to escape from the kids. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, your sounds good, man. Mate, you've been one of my favorite Australian content creators for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years or something. I used to follow you back in the old Stardust Thinking 8 days, so I'm so happy to have you on this stream, man.
Thanks for having me on.
Indeed, Franklin. As a friend of the distributors and as a long-time watcher, it's nice to finally cross paths with you, mate. So welcome, and good to finally, have a chat, I suppose.
Yes, hello to everyone in the chat as well. See a few regulars there.
Oh man, the Franklin, you I don't know a better Australian channel than yours. You've been going for so long. It's so cool, man. Thank you so much for joining this trip.
Yeah, no problem. I would have come sooner, but it's kind of an awkward time because I have little kids, so we do the whole sort of dinner and bedtime routine.
I said that in the Discord. You got family issues, and family always comes first. Of course it does. For all of those of us who are relatively traditional, so got no problem whatsoever, mate. But I'm really happy to have you on the stream.
Thanks for having me.
What are your feelings about Australia Day?
It's sort of for me, it's kind of just another day. We never really celebrated it when I was growing up. I mean, I don't remember it being as big when I was growing up in the 80s. I think it sort of really took off I would say towards the end of the 90s. I think in the Howard years. It didn't seem as big, but then I think it was also a case of fish in water. We didn't have to think about Australian identity because we just had Australian identity. It was just sort of like that. My family never really went in for all that stuff, though. Not that we were against it or anything. We just didn't go in for it, I guess. They went to a few things occasionally on Australia Day, but
so
didn't seem to be as big back then.
Like you and a bit of a party on Australia Day?
When I was older, but I mean, when I was a kid in the 80s, no. As I said, my parents didn't really go into any sort of big celebrations. I mean, we did Christmas with the in-laws, with the relatives. That was sort of about it as far as any kind of public holidays went. And then I guess when I was in my 20s, I went to a couple of things occasionally. And I went to the fireworks. I used to go to the fireworks in Melbourne, in the city. But then I actually spent a lot of time overseas, so I often wasn't here. And these days,
you have this wonderful globe share stuff that you do.
yeah. These days, I feel like the whole day has been poisoned by these twits, and then there are a lot of normies sort of trying to do whatever they're doing, and I feel like that's on the way out somehow, and they're a little bit oblivious to that. and I think they think that will just sort of last forever. Then I think one day, if and when, probably when rather than if, the day is changed, they'll just switch to doing it on that day instead. I don't know. As I said, it doesn't really feel like a particularly special day for me, actually.
I mean, kind of agree with you, Franklin, about the destiny of Australia Day. At least, I think you're quite right. I think there's a lot of people who are deluding themselves about what's actually occurring with Australia Day and the fact that it is basically a sort of an ideological political handball, and that, like you say, it's a case of when, not if. And as much as that might make us sad, we have to face facts as they are.
Yeah, the left is, that saying, Cthulhu swims slowly, but he only swims leftward. Every year it seems like the sort of hoo-ha.
I'm going to stick with this day forever because if the leftists say it so much.
Sure, but it's not going to be Australia Day for that much longer, I think, and it won't. The normies will just do as they're told. They'll just switch. They'll do as they're told. Every year it seems like it becomes more and more political. So one thing I've noticed this year compared to other years is the trend of businesses, particularly big corporations primarily, giving their employees the option to work on Australia Day and then take a different day off as a holiday. And so there are all these sort of things that are slowly eroding all of this. And I think, plus, of course, Australia is super multicultural now. So what does it mean to recent immigrants and so on? When I think I've told this story several times on my own channel, but when I was a kid for the bicentenary, so it was 1988, we had this teacher. He was a pretty crazy character, and he actually dressed up in full black. We had to come to school in some sort of costume or what have you. Most people just wore pajamas and pretended they were convicts. But this guy, he was, I don't know, he would have been in his late 40s, if not 50s, maybe older, I don't know. He came in full blackface wearing a loincloth and had a spear, and somehow he'd roped two kids, I don't know, 11-year-old kids or something into this. So there were the three of them. That was only 35 years ago that happened, and now, I mean, that's just unimaginable these days.
Well, that would be career ending, and the man would be socially ostracized for the rest of his life if he tried that.
And the school, the school would have been in big trouble for that as well. So, yeah, it's every year it just seems to become more and more political, and I think it's just a matter of when, not if. And what does that mean? Like what does it mean to someone who's been in Australia for 5 years from wherever, and we talk about all these guys with funny uniforms?
Like a real Australian? Well, but Franklin, what does that mean to someone who's been Australian all their life, or someone like me who's been here 20 years? Actually, almost 23 years now. The thing is, like, Australia was a wilderness in 1788, and from 1788 it was turned into this pretty bloody good advanced Western country. It has a load of issues, of course it does, all nations do, but like in 1788, when the first fleet arrived, it was just totally a wilderness where the most advanced thing was like a bark hut or a wooden canoe carved out of a piece of wood. And there were no roads, there were no nothing. And in the meantime, Australia has been created.
Of course, but this is sort of the idiocy of the, not just the left, but post-modernity in general, that people think they can sort of bemoan all of this but still get all the benefits of it. And if you would say to them, right, well, okay, all of you expatriate or repatriate to the UK. All of you, we can't have the Westminster system, we can't have English common law, we can't have all of the nice things, all of this infrastructure. They think you can have one without the other, and it's just a sort of, people are ahistorical. They don't understand that civilization is built and it's maintained. I mean, they think it just falls out of the sky, and you can have all this other stuff. But that's just sort of the how vacuous modern people are. They don't understand the history of it. I mean, they wouldn't. The average person in Australia, I doubt, would really understand much of this. Or, I mean, we did projects when I was a kid at school. We did them about various explorers. I did one on Major Mitchell. But I don't think they would even do that these days. It would all be sort of
Major
white
Mitchell
men and
has a
Aboriginals.
cockatoo named. He has a cockatoo named after him.
Yeah.
Correct.
So we all did some people did whatever, Bass and Flinders or Charles Sturt or whomever. But these days, I don't think they do that. It would all be evil white men, and the Aborigines were so in touch with nature, blah, blah. And isn't that horrible? Whilst having all of the benefits of civilization. But I don't know. Most people, they don't think about that stuff. They don't think like that. So
you're really right on that one, Franklin.
So when they inevitably change the date, like they've talked about making it the 8th of May, right? Because it's May 8. When they do that, it'll be like, okay, well, we get a day off then instead of in January. That's cool. Whatever. They'll just. Maybe they won't be able to barbecue because it'll be too cold or something in many parts of Australia. They won't go to the beach or whatever. But other than that, it'll be like, okay, we still get a day off, whatever. I don't think it'll mean much to them, especially if they're not from an English background, right?
Franklin, I went, well, you don't have to be English. You have to be Anglo-Catholic, I guess.
Okay. If you're not from... Let's say if your family hasn't been here for probably 2 or 3 generations, it's not going to make any difference. Like for the average guy who came over from India 10 years ago or from China or the Philippines or wherever, is it really going to matter to them whether it's the 26th of January or the 8th of May or whatever, the 29th of February or something, right? It's not going to make any difference to them. It
will to people like Furious, who I presume is like 2 or 3 generations in at least.
Actually, I have to say I'm only a first generation actually, but I think just so not to interrupt either, but just for some context, I think something happens to people who end up living in remote regions or take up industries like farming or something. I think when you actually, I think something happens to you almost at the spiritual level, right? And I don't want to get into sort of too much woo-woo or anything, but I think once you take a plot of land and you turn soil and you raise livestock and you grow crops, something sort of innate, sort of intangible entwines you to that land, right? And I think this is why, I mean, I can't speak for the experience that you guys have had. I mean, I'll just, I'll say this and maybe you two can reflect on it yourselves because I'd appreciate your opinions. I remember going to high school, in the sort of early mid 2000s, and seeing my sort of Anglo-Australian friends having a pretty, vacuous grasp of what it meant to be Western, what it meant to be Australian, what it meant to have, this sort of identity that sort of harkens back. I like to use the phraseology by Radlib, our friend Stephen Carson. He talked about the great chain of being. And that, there is this tradition that is sort of, that is a part of Australia that harkens back to, it harkens back to Queen Victoria and Mother England. It harkens back to, Elizabeth I. It harkens back to Richard the Lionheart and the Plantagenets and the Angevin Empire. It harkens back to Hastings 1066 and the, and Alfred the Great and the Anglo-Saxons and Roman Britain to a degree. Like, there's Australia is the end product of something that goes back a very, very long time in history, right? And, I would kind of be... Sorry, Andrew?
I just said 100, mate. I agree with you. Totally.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and so, I remember, like, even back then being castigated as being sort of, dare I say, a bit bigoted or xenophobic or whatever. It's like, oh, but, you're an immigrant as well. It's like, no, I'm actually defending the culture, which is more closely related to you than me. but I actually appreciate the value of it. I know where it's come from, and I know how valuable it is. You know, once you've studied classics and you sort of understand, you know, to touch on what Franklin was saying, you know, like the civilization isn't without a context. It doesn't just, you know, materialize out of the ether. You know, civilization actually takes a lot of dedication and discipline and hard work and sacrifice and you know, and great organization and you know, and purposeful conduct by the majority of its citizens to make happen, and not just to make happen, but then to pass that down across generations and generations and generations. It's a very difficult thing. It's why, you know, when we're talking about these subjects, we talk about, you know, the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians in Egypt, and we, you know, their barbarous neighbors are barely a footnote. We don't talk about the Libyans or the Gudaians that much, or the, you know, the Elamites. The civilization part is really, really hard.
And to be fair, Furious, like you and your family are like relatively large scale farmers, or used to be. And that's hard in Australia. That's not an easy thing to do, because Australia is a relatively arid country.
It's marginal. It's uncompromising. It's difficult, and we also sit on some of the least productive soils on the planet. And European men, well, women as well, but European man has made this continent a breadbasket. Despite that,
I think what the problem is that Australia is a really urbanized country, and I think two things. One thing is that I think it was born into modernity, so it doesn't have all these really sort of pre-modern traditions like Halloween and all of that sort of stuff. There's that. It was sort of a proto Bugman society right from the get-go, pretty much.
I know where you're going with this, Franklin. I
became
agree with you.
became very urbanized very quickly. And when you've got people nowadays who can press an app on their phone and Uber Eats turns up. They don't have to have any connection. They don't have to understand where their food came from. They don't have to have any connection to the land, because they literally eat the bugs and live in the pod, and they are disconnected from the sort of normal things that would be markers of civilization, and the land, and having to fight and die for the land, all of that sort of stuff. So they're the ultimate bug men. I think there's this notion, particularly amongst foreigners, that we're all crocodile hunters or something here, but statistically,
you know,
the average Australian is a complete bugman statistically. Like you pick any other random country on the planet, and where like Hong Kong or something would be more urbanized than Australia, but pretty much any other random place on the planet would be more in touch with these things than the average Australian statistically, because something like 80% of people live in the top 10 settlements in Australia. So it's no wonder that people can entertain all this nonsense and think that well, we can just take all of this 200 and something years of history and just throw it in the trash can, because it doesn't mean anything. Because for them it doesn't, because they just press an app on their phone, they go over to a wall and flick a switch. They can complain about climate change or whatever, because they have this sort of rarefied existence where they can go and flick a switch on a wall, and light or heat or cooling comes on. They can go and turn on a tap and hot water comes out of it.
Clean water comes for that matter, you know.
So there's sort of the ultimate bugman, because they don't ever have to understand what these things are and where they came from. I mean, I'm always just blown away whenever I try to do anything outdoors, and I think, wow, like cutting up wood, like imagine doing that back in the day where you had to clear paddocks and all you had were hand tools and some beasts of burden. Imagine doing that. And imagine doing that in the middle of summer. That must have been horrible.
Well,
and
frankly,
we just take
drop
this
an
for
anecdote
granted.
for you.
Sure.
Can I drop it? Yeah. So like you don't know this. I mean, this is the first time we've interacted. I and Duke knows that my family had recently retired, just after, you know, I mean, we had our farm up for sale like during the COVID situation, and afterwards, you know, when things opened up, we sort of sold them. My parents have, you know, gone to do other things, but sort of moving on to a new phase of life. But my father and I actually took a harvest contract, you know, where we were from. Like one of the people who bought our farm actually needed more labor, so my father and I went out on a shared sort of farm contract, you know, for the seasonal work, and we actually stayed in one of the old homesteads on what was our property, and in the middle of summer we were losing water pressure, and you know, this is just like an example of what you're talking about, like the scale of it. Is that in order to get you know, fresh water, we have to have a bore that is several kilometers away from the homesteads, and then that bore, but via you know, there's a diesel engine connected to it and a generator that pumps water up to a pump that's at the top of the hill, which then sort of decanters that water down to the homesteads and the sheds and whatever. And we actually had to find the rupture in the line because we were sort of pumping water up and the tank wasn't recharging. And so we had to sort of find where the break was in the line, and we eventually found it. And that, you know, my dad and I, you know, in the middle of harvest, in the middle of summer, you know, we've got, you know, we've had to sort of improvise, dig a half trench. You know, we've got our tools on the back of the ute. And, you know, like none of us are plumbers, you know, we're not qualified as plumbers, but we sort of, as a result of our situation, you need to be a little bit of an electrician, a little bit of a mechanic, a little bit of a plumber, a little bit of a, you know, agronomist. You need to be a little bit of everything. And we had to replace this pump because if we, this bit of pipe, because if we hadn't replaced the pipe, we wouldn't be able to fill the water tank, and then we wouldn't be able to have showers. We couldn't water our fruit trees. You know, we couldn't, you know, wash our dishes. You know, like something as basic as that. Whereas in the city, if a main ruptures, well, you call the council or you call the utilities company, and they just fix it, and magically happens. But we actually had to do that ourselves, and that was just, you know, just last month. It was at the start, actually, the start of this month, start of January, first week of January, we did it. Yeah, there's an example.
Australians traditionally could fix stuff. I mean, like I know that Franklin, for example, runs a small holding or a small farm, shall we say?
Oh, it's not really a farm. It's just our property. You know, we just grow some stuff and have a few animals.
I have no idea the Franklin, and I'm not going to argue with you about it, but it like, to me, it's small holding and a small farm. And I know that Furious used to run quite big farms in his day, although they are changing a bit these days.
I've gone from a sheep property to an orchard.
Yeah. But if you didn't do that, I mean, that was one of the ways Australians made money and became, like, how can I put it, leading Australians, I guess. You had to do that. But like, as Furious was saying, it's a frontier thing. Like, to make something from nothing, which every Australian really had to do, that's how you make civilization. You make something from nothing. Like, they sit you on this crappy property, which you might have to, like, you probably have to dig out, I don't know, 150 stumps from. But you have to do that. And unless you do that, you ain't going to make any money, you know? If you do that, and then you can run your property relatively well. Sorry, guys, I'm not totally sober. I'm not totally sober, the Franklin. I beg your pardon, mate. It's Australia. But I went out with some mates at lunchtime. But
at least you go to the spirit of it, Mr. Iron Duke. That's the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I don't care what they do with Australia Day. I'll celebrate this day as Australia Day until I die. But yeah, unless you can go to this property that they give you, as some World War I soldiers got, as even some World War II soldiers got, and unless you could make it work, you ain't going to make no money, you know? You ain't going to support your family. So the guys that did, well, good on them, because, like, they were hardworking bastards, basically.
It's just that, I think it's that cycle of civilization. Strong men create good times. And they were, in a sense, Australia's been a victim of its own success, because Australia has been so prosperous, and it really did come from nothing in such a short period of time. I think it's very easy for a lot of Australians to take that for granted and to have this real sense of triumphalism that, oh, we're just the best ever, we're awesome. And we can, in fact, we're so good that we can even discard the things that make us good because we are just so awesome. I really do think it's Bugman Central. Actually, I'm not sure if there's another place.
100. The Franklin and I totally agree with you. But old time Aussies were like some of the best men you would ever meet. Modern Australians are totally Bugman. Totally agree with you.
Can it be sort of said, if we can use a historical analogy, because I know what Franklin's getting at, and again I agree with him. It's kind of like imagining that the Roman urban bugman who loiters in the bathhouse, drinks the water from the fountain, is celebrating the successes of the Roman legion that was victorious in eastern Syria, and these Chads who built aqueducts on the frontier and built a fort and defeated the Persians. It's like you have the soy bug man sort of celebrating the achievements of Chad out in the frontier. I kind of get that imagery of Franklin being described, and it's true actually. I think that's quite right. You have these lesser men celebrating the achievements of better men and trying to use that to sort of fulfill their own sense of inferiority. I think that's very apparent in Australia. I think you're quite right, Franklin.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really amazed at how much this country has changed in the past, say, 35 years since the bicentenary. It's like chalk and cheese. The people are really, really different. And the funny thing to me especially is that a lot of the people who were around then are still around, but they're really different. The average Australian, the way they speak, the way they speak in this sort of corporate speak where they don't want to touch any third rails or what have you. And it's really weird to me because those people just a generation or two ago were radically different. The culture has changed so much. It's quite startling, actually. It's pretty much not the same place anymore.
100.
It's been a very rapid transformation that I can agree with for sure.
It's really weird. I mean, I lived overseas from 2007 to 2018, and I came back periodically to visit, but I would say, I've been back almost 5 years, and I would say that I still haven't got over the culture shock of it because it really does seem like I've just gone to a completely different country.
100. The Franklin, I agree with that. Look, I have arrived here in 2000, and in 2000, Australia was still basically Australia, but it's hugely changed over the last 23 years, to the extent that, like, many Australians don't realize, like, Australia is Australia because real Australians made it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I've got a hypothesis for you both.
You had a thing. I remember the Franklin. You did a thing, like how many pianos there were in Australia in something like, I don't know, 1900.
Yeah, Australia had a population of 3 million, and there were 700, or was it 750,000 pianos? So it's basically one for every 4 people. Now, not everyone had a piano, but obviously every church, every school, every community hall, they would have had pianos. But obviously a lot of families had pianos. There's this sort of notion that Australians weren't cultured or what have you. They were. Australia was an outpost of civilization. Obviously it wasn't sort of where all the action was at, like London, for instance, in the late 19th century, but it was an outpost of all of that. And it's not like that at all anymore. People,
very true.
People, yeah, but what we can say,
the whole world is not like that.
Yeah, of course. It's not just Australia, but
sadly.
But
It's
I think
particularly pronounced.
yeah. I was going to say you're right. It's particularly pronounced here. I know what Franklin's getting at. It's the whole idea that when you come across a piano in Australia, like aside from the rare families who have them, of which my family is actually one of them, because both the women in my family play piano, and I learned basic piano but never got past that. But you're right. It's this idea that when you come across a piano in Australia, it's usually as a backdrop to like some trendy new pub that they've opened, and people
Yeah.
like they'll recognize it as a piano but not understand the beauty that can come from it. That's the dilapidation that's happened in this country culturally. Would you agree, Franklin?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, if I may, because I want to put this hypothesis to you guys, because I had this pop into my mind a little while back. I was actually watching like a Paul Hogan special, like from his early work, like long before he did Crocodile Dundee, like his early skit work, right?
I used to love Paul Hogan back in the day.
Yeah. So the hypothesis is that one of the phrases I tend to use to describe Australia is I call it Galapagos syndrome. And a part of it is that if anyone has ever been to the Galapagos Islands or is familiar with the Galapagos Islands, you'd know that a lot of its native fauna is essentially vulnerable to any kind of predators because there's no predators in and around the Galapagos. But if those species were to ever venture beyond the immediate vicinity of the Galapagos, they would just be sort of hunted and killed. They have almost no defense. And it's almost as if, if you read out the lyrics of a national anthem, one of the lines is, land girt by sea, as in that Australia is a country, island, continent, or sort of all in one. And that aside from the Japanese dropping a few bombs on Darwin, a handful on Broome, and I think there might have been a couple of other raids, with the exception of the British colonial story, once Australia was created as a country and federated, when all these colonies and states joined together, West Australia and Victoria, Northern Territory was created thereafter, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, all brought together as one country. That we haven't had like this story of, when you look through the history of, say, the history of Italy or the Italy of Britain or the history of Germany or Russia or Poland, where there is a centuries long sort of struggle for survival, for continuation of waxing and waning, of prosperity and decline. Almost every European country has this story. I mean, a great example would be Greece. I mean, Alexander's kingdom once spanned from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus, and now Greece is this tiny little country at the bottom end of the Balkan Peninsula. So and indeed Greece didn't exist for 500 years whilst the Ottomans occupied it. So every European nation by and large has this memory etched into it somehow, but Australia never had that. Australia wasn't occupied. Australia hasn't been sort of really invaded. And likewise, because very able people came to this country, people who were determined to build a new life, people who were adaptable and could improvise and were tough and resourceful and whatever, built a wonderful country here in what is a very difficult biome, a difficult climate, a marginal climate, on difficult terrain and not very fertile soil. Like Franklin has said, it's sort of being taken for granted. Oh, well, we have our plenty, we have our prosperity, we can just sit on our hands and just charge property tax and payroll tax and land tax and fill the coffers, then pay out everything in welfare, and everyone can be happy-go-lucky and whatever. Circling back to the Galapagos thing, there's this idea that sort of I've conceived of that, or I'm sure others have, at least it's entered my mind, that Australia has this idea of it's sort of commonplace in our psyche that Australians will say she'll be right, which basically means no problem, no worries. And to some degree, I think it was a defense against subversion, because Australians just didn't have this earnestness that, say, other countries had, like, say, Europeans or Americans, where, yeah, Roe v. Wade, she'll be right, let's pass, let's do sort of no fault divorce, she'll be right. Like, Australians don't care. But there comes a point where subversion actually gains fertile ground in that environment where people don't care. Like, there's not enough people who want to protect the institutions. There aren't enough people who care enough about defending the country, the social fabric, all these things. And this is why, I don't know, because you and I, Franklin, only seem like a few years apart. We were sort of maybe separated by half a generation or so. But we have seen such a transformation in our lifetimes, at least, and certainly since Iron Duke's been in Australia, where that she'll be right thing was initially defense, but it actually allowed for this torrent, this tidal wave to subsume us all, where sort of once enough indoctrination happened and once enough people got, you know, fed through the university and school system, right, there weren't actually enough people to care about rolling it back. There weren't enough people to sort of hold the sandbags up, and now we've been subsumed by the eternal sort of Australian bugman. Is that nonsense, or do you think that's partially true? What do you guys think?
I think it's true. I think it's not just European countries, pretty much every other nation on the planet, probably with the exception of Australia and New Zealand, at some point has had a major conflict. Certainly Latin America's been like that. Most of Asia's been like that. Africa's been like that as well. Probably Australia and New Zealand would be the only two places just about that haven't had that at some point. The other thing I think is, so Australia was, as I said, was born into modernity. So we didn't have a revolution or anything like that. We just said, well, we want to make a new country. And the government in charge in Britain said, yeah, okay, sure. Okay, that's good. So the birth of this country wasn't arduous. Also, I think Australians have always been on the winning side of history. First under the British and now under the Americans. So, yeah, there have been a few things along the way, like Vietnam, but basically we've always been on the winning side in every major conflict.
Wins less. The Franklin, like, mate, you got a great channel, and I really love you, but Australia has won much more often under the British than it has under the Americans, to be fair.
Yeah, sure. But the point is that whilst America was losing various wars, they were still really dominant culturally and economically and so on. And we rode their coattails. We haven't been on the losing side in a big way, where we've had to stop and think, well, that really didn't work and we really suffered for it. We need to reassess all of our basic assumptions. Most countries, when your country's occupied for centuries, like if you're Hungary, for instance, and you're occupied for whatever it was, 150 years or something by the Ottomans, when you're in that kind of situation, and when other countries have come through and kicked the crap out of you, you have to reassess a whole lot of things, because you can't be you can have pride in your culture, but you can't be arrogant about it, because it's hard to be arrogant when someone else is ruling you. But Australia's always been on the winning side, so to speak. And so we're all the stupid fucking ideas that Australians believe in now, modern bugmen. Well, of course they can believe those things, because we've never truly lost and suffered. So
you might say they have the luxury to be able to do so, right, Franklin?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I do agree with you. I think that our country wasn't born in a revolution. It wasn't born out of having to fight for hundreds of years to kick occupiers out of here or what have you. It's always just been, okay, well, we just built a country, and all of these things have just sort of happened to us. We've always been on the right side of history. In the Second World War, we barely suffered. There were entire countries that were leveled, essentially. Yeah. So we've never really suffered, even during sort of economic downturns. They haven't been anywhere near as bad as in other parts of the world. So yeah, it's almost like we're immature or something like that. Like we're childlike. We haven't sort of felt the pain of defeat or the pain of rejection or whatever, like love lost or what have you, like a terrible relationship,
or crushed by occupation and destroyed in war and that sort of feeling. Yeah, no, I totally know what you mean.
We've had this very charmed existence.
I remember my Australian girlfriend in like 2000 said to me, like absolutely, totally sober, and she believed it, that if anyone was trying to do anything bad to Australia, the Royal Navy would arrive and come and save her, which I thought was like really cute because she was a girl, and To be honest, I mean, like if I had my way, yeah, absolutely, that would happen. But she thought, yeah, that will just automatically happen. The whole of the Royal Navy will arrive and save Australia. But I did think it was cute because she's an Aussie girl. Or she was an Aussie girl, I should say. But yeah, you're right, Franklin. It's Australians have this idea that I don't know. Australia is strange because it's kind of half American and half UK. And most of the good Australians are mostly like the Anglo-Celtic Australians, in my experience. But yeah, my pal said to me, yeah, if there's any problem in Australia, the whole of the Royal Navy will arrive and save them. And do you know what? I wish that was true. I do wish that was true because we should, and that would be kind of what we should do because, Australians have gone overseas many times to fight for the Brits.
Yeah, no, good point, Iron Duke. I think that's right. And what's also worth is sort of just the way you frame that last point about they've always gone to sort of overseas to fight for the Brits, and I think that in part is sort of it as well, insofar that whenever Australians have gone to fight overseas, whether, because we touched on this with the stream with Semigog, Breaker Morant is one of the sort of the great Australian movie productions, whether we fought, with the British alongside them in the Boer War, whether we
very inaccurate.
It's an accurate film, but I'm just saying it's a good film in terms of, if you like productions, right? Whether you consider the Australians who fought at Gallipoli and were sort of basically forced to charge up a sheer mountain slope. I mean, I've been to Gallipoli myself. I went to the 100th anniversary of the campaign, and I mean, I couldn't even imagine the idea of
fight. It's a shit place to fight, mate.
Absolutely. And then the swamp-like terrain of Flanders, fighting in the winter in the trenches, against the Germans. And then whenever the Australians fought, in North Africa with the Brits, when they fought in New Guinea, which would have been really tough and difficult, in the jungles, and the Australians at Long Tan in Vietnam. What we've actually done is that I guess a lot of people have said this about the world wars expended Europe's best men, and that's true. And I think Australia's no exception in that regard. I mean, who did we send over? We sent over the sort of the young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed sort of sons of shall I say, qualitative elites in the past, men of academic stature, of historical stature, of proper upbringing. They would have sent over, hardy bushmen, sons of farmers, tough people. They're the ones who mostly
bravest of the brave in the whole country.
Yeah. And considering that, you got to think Germany.
The brave used to go and join the Aussie diggers.
Yeah, exactly. So who's left? You have a bunch of survivors, and then everyone else. And I think, if you look at, say, world populations, although you can argue, yes, the French took a lot of casualties in World War One. Yes, the Germans took a lot of casualties in both wars. Yes, the Italians suffered in World War One particularly. World War II was more of an economic devastation than a population one. Britain, I mean, as you know, ING, Britain had a volunteer army up until 1917 when they had to bring in conscription just at the very end. All these European nations had been bled across these two world wars. But the thing is, at the very least, there was still like a substantive, body of population whereby some kind of demographic repair could take place. I mean, leading up to the world wars, the German Empire had at least a population of, I think, around 35, 40 million, maybe thereabouts. The British Empire would have been comparable. The French, had largely repaired its demography from the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, you're talking about countries with tens of millions of people, after which, if you suffer such a disaster, you at least can come back from it. I mean, Australia sent over its best and brightest. A lot of them were killed. I mean, we had many survive too, but a lot were killed. But we only had a meager population. We were a population back then of a few million, so maybe that had a more pronounced effect on us than what we realize. I don't know, it's just a thought. I could be wrong, but
Yeah, but I wonder about that because in part I agree with you. In another way, I think this problem seems to have become really pronounced in the past 20 years or thereabouts. Because if you look at culture from the 70s and the 80s, and you look at just sort of interviews of people on the street by the ABC in 1982 or something,
I love that footage, by the way.
they seemed a lot different. So I don't think it's just that they're all gunned down, all the good genes were gunned down and bled out. I think something really strange has happened culturally over the past 2 decades or so. And it could also be the type of immigration that we've had over the past couple of decades. But
just for
there's
context
something.
sake, Franklin, I meant that more as like it was a factor rather than it was the thing that caused it. But because I actually think you're right. I think these two things act in unison. I think you're right.
There's something that's really strange that's happened over the past 20 odd years.
Australia has lost its vision. There used to be a vision of Australia as this great southern land, and I think that's been lost.
I wonder also if Australians have become really pretentious in a way that they weren't. Back in the day, you sort of would have copped it. I think this is probably before your time, but they used to have these ads for Big M milk. Those milk, those flavored milk.
Drinks, like Masters choc milk and spearmint milk and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
So they used to have these ads, and there was one in particular. So it had these just sort of ordinary people, and they were in a diner or something, a cafe or something, out of the middle of nowhere, and one of them had some sort of old Valiant or something, some old Australian car, and these two guys came in and they were giving them a hard time. These two sort of 80s yuppies with an imported car or whatever, they were giving them a hard time. And then the sort of thing at the end was you saw the yuppies get back in their car with the sunroof, and they're opening the sunroof, and this carton of milk was falling off the sunroof presumably it was going to land on them. And one of them said, and at the same time, you saw these ordinary people walking past, and they were saying, one of them said, "Oh, what happened to your Big M?" And he said, "I don't know, I must have left it somewhere." And that was sort of really an iconic ad when I was growing up. But now everyone's they've got a property portfolio, and they've all been, I've traveled a lot, but they've all been overseas, and they've done all these things, and there's this cultural cringe towards all of that kind of stuff. And people will look back at the television or what have you from the 1980s or 1990s, like, oh, isn't that cringeworthy? It's so parochial. Australians were so parochial back then. They didn't know what a cappuccino was, or whatever. And yet, despite all of that, they seemed to do pretty well back then. It seems to me like something really weird.
Heck, at least they had a sense of self back then, right?
Yeah, it seems like Australians have become they've become bugmen. They're really pretentious. Like,
but Australians used to
the word you use though, Franklin, yuppie, is quite true. Like, yeah, it's very much a case of rather than sort of being people who are happy with their lot and grateful. So sorry, Andrew, and we're grateful with what they had. They very much have been enamored by this keeping up with the Joneses mentality. Like you say, they've got to buy into the new like into the yuppie real estate. They've got to they got to buy the latest Mercedes-Benz. They got to it's become so vividly materialistic and not in a good way, in my opinion.
I totally agree with that. I think Australians used to think, well, I'm an Aussie, and the general idea of an Aussie was from Gallipoli and things like the charge at Beersheba and World War II, in North Africa. But these days, Australians don't seem to have that anymore. I don't think it's right to say Australians are like bigger. I don't think it's right to say they think they're bigger than they were. It's like the really great stuff that Australians did in history today, most Australians don't even know about. That's what I think is.
Yeah, but it's an intentional. I mean, I could be wrong, but my take would be that it's an intentional cultural amnesia, the conditions of which are created by people who, much like elites in the United States of America, and the elites in England, and the elites in France or
100.
wherever, they have a hostility to our legacy story. They have a
Yeah.
hostility to the legacy people who made that country what it is, and so of course, like you say, like the act, the charge of Beersheba, like the Rats of the Brook, or like Long Tan and Port Moresby, Kokoda Trail. These things are going to be inevitably shoveled into some like dark backroom of our national psychology, right? And only ever drawn out for specific purposes of trying to, like whether it's sort of rallying feelings of the GAE, as we talked about in our circles or whatever, right? That will only be used tactically, right, to sort of rally people to action in order to protect the shall I say, the means of those who have their hands on the levers of power. But in all other cases, people are not permitted to take pride in that, because it is bigoted, it is offensive, it is all these things, it is all these constructs, right, that act against the ultimate goals of these people. That's the only way I can frame it,
You know that movie, The Castle? So that was released in the late 90s, I think.
97-ish, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
It was right near the end of the decade. And I don't think they could make that movie today, because
Never.
the family in that film, they're sort of obviously they sort of make fun of them in a light-hearted sense. They're sort of laughing with them at them. Ultimately, those guys are the heroes of the film, and it's because they're simple
were a
people.
typical Aussie family.
And it's because they're simple that they're good and they succeed in the end. I don't think that movie could be made today.
And they're tackling the big end of town and little guys, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and it's sort of everything. Sort of they take everything in their stride. Like, okay, they're a little bit clueless about. There's that bit where the father gives the speech. His daughter marries the Greek guy, and he gives that speech, and he sort of inadvertently kind of half insults them, but then he says actually they're all right, and he says something in Greek to them, and they realize that he's accepted them, and all these things. Like there's that bit with the neighbor where he wants to give him cash, and he says, "What is it with wogs and cash?" So there are all these kind
put the cash away, mate. What is it with wogs and cash?
That's right.
Well,
So there are all these bits in the movie where they're really kind of rough around the edges, but they're just they're not doing it because they're horrible people. They're maybe a little bit parochial, but actually there's a lovable side to them as well. I don't think it could be made today at all. Those people would be mocked mercilessly. It wouldn't be a sort of the way that you might sort of have some playful banter with your friends or your relatives. It would be mean-spirited.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't have any redeeming qualities.
Yeah. For example, right, it's a bit like, and there's two obvious examples of this, right? And I mean, we got an Englishman with us, so he'd definitely agree with me on one of these. But on one hand, right, is how American media, and for instance, for anyone who like still pays attention to media today, like one of the popular shows out there today is called Schitt's Creek, which is about like some wealthy New York family from a specific background. I'll say no more. They end up like taking residence in a town like what is framed to be the South of America, right? Like of course people are dumb and ill-educated, and they're just like beer swilling simpletons, and they speak with that drawn accent, and we don't got no strangers around here kind of type folk, right? And they are literally mocked relentlessly in the show and made to look like the most contemptible people in existence. And then you sort of have like ING, you well know this archetype of Gaz, love me football, love me North FC, simple as love me geezers, love me pub, like the simple chubby portly Englishman who just loves his simple things, just loves his life the way he doesn't want it to change, like it doesn't actually bear malevolence. But of course in British media, those people are sort of like the equivalent of the American Southerners, who are just used as this sort of beating bag, this target of castigation and humiliation,
100%.
right? Just so they
100%.
can make them look bad and just to some degree demoralize those kind of people as well. It's really cynical, and I think you're quite right, Franklin. The castle probably represents people like that, or to some degree, like possibly even like Kath and Kim and like shows like that. It's the same thing of trying to humiliate these little people and make them seem the parochial people are the past and they're no good. And in fact, if society moves past them, all the better. And if you really look at the nuts and bolts of that, that's actually really horrifying.
When they're
control the
actually the
institutions
best
do that.
people, when they're actually the best people.
Precisely, yeah.
I never really
they're
got
actually
into
the
Kath and
best
Kim
people.
very much.
Oh, no,
but it seemed to me like
my old girl used to watch it, but I'm just using that as an example, right?
it seemed to me like that was different to the castle, though. When was Kath and Kim made? Was that in the 2000s?
That
I
was
think it
early
the
2000s. I mean, they're very different,
Yeah.
obviously. I'm just saying, like that.
Yeah, it seems like that.
Simple white Australian, you know.
I always found that to be mean spirited, though. Like it wasn't sort of playfully making
but
fun
that's
of them.
the point.
It was. I thought it was really mean spirited. Whereas I think the castle
it occurs.
wasn't.
Yeah, you're right. The castle's endearing, but within a 10-year time span, it went from light-hearted endearment to sort of mild
really
mocking,
nasty,
and now it's been dialed to
Yeah.
11. You know.
100.
But the point I'm trying to make is that archetype
Well,
has become the
the
laughing
Franklin
stock.
I know has lived overseas. The Franklin I know has lived overseas and has wandered around the world because he does these really excellent globe share stories on his channel. But like now he's back in Australia and he's running, I don't know, what you would call a small farm or a small holding. But he now realizes how ridiculous all of this shit is. And what you were saying earlier, Furious, is totally true. I mean, it's like they're trying to slag off the people who made Australia. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to slag them off.
The damn bedrock of our countries, whether it's the USA, whether it's Britain, whether it's here, those people are the bedrock of these countries, and they are the primary target of mass media humiliation, and it is despicable, and we all need to see it for what it is.
100%.
Yeah, and the other thing about it is that they wouldn't do the equivalent about people who are not, say, from an Anglo-Celtic background. They wouldn't do the equivalent
100%
kind of thing about those people either in their countries or here. Like they'll talk about these uncultured bogans, for instance. Okay, well, how much more cultured are people from other countries who have migrated to Australia? Because I very much doubt that they're reading the classic literature from their civilization, whatever that is. They're deracinated. They're whatever the ethnic equivalent of a bogan is. They're like that, only worse. The average Anglo-Celtic Australian is actually more useful, at least, and does have some inkling of culture. But they would never do that about that. They would never talk about these other people who come here who are completely uncultured and materialistic.
Never frame them in that way, right, Frank?
Yeah, they're never going to sort of mock them as guys who just want to wear tracksuits and hang out at shopping malls. You know, there was that one show, Pizza, that sort of, I don't know how that show ever got made.
Oh my god, that pizza fully sick, mate.
Yeah, I don't know how they could ever make that kind of show again, but
yeah,
they will not level the same kind of ridicule at other groups who, to me, seem like they're not particularly cultured as they do at sort of Anglo-Celtic people who live in the outer suburbs.
Yeah, a dude who's put on this bit of land and he's got to like get rid of every tree stump on his bit of land. That's fucking hard work. But
and they were never you're never going to see
whatever these days.
Yeah, you're never going to see a Four Corners or one of those kind of shows report about bogans in some other country. They're never going to do that. Even if they
Yeah.
take some guy who's completely illiterate and has no teeth in his mouth, they're somehow going to portray him as having some sort of spiritual connection to the land, and he's actually this great mystic. They're not going to say this guy is a complete oaf, but they won't hesitate to do that about the average Anglo-Celt in this country.
And this is why, because obviously, given my background, like I'm around a lot of people who, are agriculturalists and farmers and pastoralists, and they're in my circle. They're, my father has a lot of friends, and I mean, my dad did a lot of advocacy work in the 80s and 90s in agriculture. So, you might say that I sort of know people in those circles, and it's a case of I always make the point, like say if we ever,
hey mate, Furious is like our farming correspondent, I guess.
Well, it's actually funny. I'm going to touch on that actually, and the point I'm making in these circles is that I always say to like the farmer, the cockies as we call them, right? Like the farmer blokes. It's like, don't ever be roped in when the ABC, which is sort of our public equivalent of the BBC, right? Whenever they ship out a correspondent or a journalist once every 18 months and they stick on a Cuba on their hat, they drive a Toyota Land Cruiser and they go out to the farm and they pretend to care. Remember, these creatures hate you. They hate your way of life. They hate what you hold dear. They hate the fact that you're semi-independent. They despise almost everything which you represent and hold dear. Always keep that in mind. Don't be suckered into thinking, oh, they actually care about me now. They don't. And, it always happens. They'll send a camera crew out to, regional Queensland. They go out to like Gundawindi or Emerald, or they'll go to, Wagga Wagga or, Broken Hill, or they'll go to Kalgoorlie or the Wheatbelt or Geraldton or something in Western Australia, or the mines or something, or they go to Coal Country or the Atherton Tablelands in Queensland. And it's the same thing. It's always like, oh, no, actually, you've had floods or you've had drought and it's really, really terrible. We're really sorry. And, we got to tell the Australian people this message. And then meanwhile, there's a plethora of political policies, of bureaucratic constraints, of trade policies, of even cultural hostility that exists against these people that makes their lives harder. So, like, quit the bullshit. Like, we know what's going on. I'm sorry to curse, but it's a joke.
100%, man. 100%.
And sadly, desperate people become desperate and think that, okay, we have a journalist here, we have a camera crew here, we can tell our story, they care. And the problem is people who are good-hearted and who don't think ill of people, man, fall into that trap, and it's a dramatic pity that they do. And Sky News in this country is one of the worst culprits of it. Let me just say that, because they pretend to be right, they pretend to be conservative, they pretend to be patriotic, and instead they march along with the sort of the general inertia of this country. And like we've spoken in our circles before, the worst kind of opposition is a false opposition.
Yeah. I can't stand Sky News. They're atrocious. I have a couple of friends who are always telling me I should watch Sky News. I can't watch more than about 5 seconds of it. I'd actually rather watch something that's really left-wing than Sky News.
Yeah,
it's just atrocious.
At least it's honest, right? Like it's we actually hate you. We'll tell you. We won't pretend to be your friend.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And just they have all these other stupid agendas. They're very, they're pro-Israel and all. But what the fuck does that have to do with us? Any of that sort of stuff, but those are, they're always talking about those kinds of issues, and what we need is just sort of more tax breaks for major corporations, and they're a bunch of muppets, those guys. I really don't know how anyone can watch the Sky News.
We've had 2 years of COVID lockdowns. Well, to boost the economy, to get the big line going back up, we got to open the floodgates again. Got to let the immigrants in. It's like, oh, great, here we go. Thank you, Sky News. Very, very cool, Sky News. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. And Sky News is like relatively better than like Sky News. Australian Sky News is relatively better than UK Sky News, but they're still just colonized.
But at least, to cleave to Franklin's point, at least British Sky News, which is owned by the NBC company, is honest. Sorry, MSNBC is honest in its left-wing agenda. Like, it doesn't actually try to be. It doesn't try to go to people who are right of centre and go, well, we're actually afraid we care about you. Like, they'll always send Paul Murray out to some country town and say, oh yeah, I love country folk, I love V8 supercars, I love beer, and then, he leaves, and then that community isn't given the slightest bit of attention for like 5 years. Like, who gives a shit about the people?
Well, I know
or whatever,
the Franklins Yeah. Look, I know that the Franklin's local mates are mostly small farmers and people like that. And the Franklin doesn't have any time whatsoever for these people. And because I know that the Franklin is a good man, I know that he's correct about these things.
It's just really sad to see the way these guys get corralled so easily, because Sky News basically just has to run some sort of headline like, "Oh, the Greenie's gone mad," and then all of these guys
Oh, for
dutifully
God's
fall
sake.
in line and vote or preference the LNP. Because we can't get the Greenies, in power. We must vote for the coalition because otherwise we'll get the Greenies. And you
Yeah.
say, well, how's that coalition working out for you?
Yeah. Yeah, like I was going to say, it's kind of like the LA, or like the Liberals are kind of like the castrated fake opposition, and then the Nationals are kind of like the Catamite agricultural party who do nothing for agricultural areas. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard me say this, Franklin or Iron Duke, but the only two national politicians I've ever had any respect for is, and I know he's a bit of an idiot and he should keep it in his pants and be a good dad and husband, but Barnaby Joyce will actually, in his own way, even though he sometimes doesn't quite get the framing right or whatever, but I actually genuinely think Barnaby Joyce gives a shit about his constituents and about the bush, right? And the other person who's actually managed to do well for his constituents is there's a Western Australian national politician who's now retired by the name of Brendan Grills. And Brendan Grills is the man who actually managed to facilitate a cut of what they were calling royalties for regions, right? Which was essentially a guaranteed cut of mining profits. Because as we all know, in Australia, mining rights are state-based rather than national. They're not based federally; they're based on a state basis, right? And Grills managed to secure a wedge of that mining profit for regional communities, non-urban communities in Western Australia. And yet the Liberal Party in WA accused him of agrarian socialism. It's like, no, Brendan Grills is actually doing what the left always do in a political manner, and that is secure a slice for his lot. He's done the same thing for his constituents, which is what you people should be doing. Because none of you have a pair, you're not going to actually do it. You'd rather castigate him, who's actually ostensibly on the same side as you, in order to have the approval of the people who are opposite you. And it's from that moment on, I just never could. I mean, it didn't always apply to me because I haven't always lived in one spot in Australia. But from that point on, my faith in the Liberal Party as a political entity was shaken. And then the fate of Tony Abbott made me tear up my membership, and I've never given the Liberals a second thought afterwards.
Fair enough.
What do you think? What do you think about Cato?
Also, Barnaby Joyce is two of our minions says Barnaby Joyce's fake cowboy hat. I have to say that, like in Australia, you don't have a cowboy hat; you have a ringer's hat. So there we
and
go.
a Kubra.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Carry on, guys.
So go, Franklin.
What do you think of Cato? I don't really know very much about him.
I love Cato. Cato is, if someone had to say to you, if someone said to me, all right, you have to go into Australian pub and you have to pick the most honest politician here, and if you don't, that scene from Indiana Jones where the American character drinks from the wrong chalice, he like ages and dies really quickly. If it was like that kind of a test, right? It was like go into Parliament and select the most honest person, and if you don't, you'd suffer that fate. I would pick Cato. Like he would be the only person I'd actually have a molecule of trust in compared to everyone else.
Yeah, he's an interesting character because I think many on the left don't quite. He's just so out there they don't really even know.
They can't compute him.
Yeah, I mean, it might be that he's a solo act too, so he's not particularly influential, so they overlook him for that reason. But yeah, he seems to cop less flack than a lot of fairly milquetoast LNP politicians.
Well, I think Cato gets by because he probably adheres to the old rule of, well, speak your mind and don't give a shit what the bastards say. And I think for the leftist activists and agitators in this country, there are more prime targets. Like you'll get someone like I'm trying to think of a specific particular person, but like, if you could get any number of people from the LNP, you could get Julie Bishop, or you could get I'm trying to think of that I'm trying to think of that senator from over east. You could get any sort of number of people to just sort of like, oh no, I'm sorry, like I'm mistaken, I didn't mean it. Any kind of milquetoast center-rightist ostensibly, I actually kind of like Amanda Stoker, because I don't want to sort of throw her under the bus, but like there'll be any number of people who are like, oh no, I don't actually mean this, but and it's like, no, just be Katter, just say what you say, tilt your kubra and walk away. Like the moment you give these creatures credence, you've lost. Like giving them oxygen is what gives them power, so don't give them oxygen. Like, don't even think about what they say. It doesn't matter. I think that's Katter's secret sauce. I could be wrong, but that's how I take it anyway.
I think also probably because his electorate is so remote that there are kind of no stakes or something like that. They don't have there's nothing at stake for the average bugman leftist, because they wouldn't even know what to do.
And his constituency would never turn on him either. Like regional Northern Queensland, like they're not going to turn on their man who represents them.
Yeah, well, he's one of the most popular politicians in Australia, and he's been so for 20 years or something. That guy, one day he's just going to drop dead. I don't know what they're going to do afterwards.
Well, his son's a politician, and I mean, his son's, the acorns drop pretty close to the oak tree. He's just not as bold as his dad. Bless you, Iron Duke. But again, like he's pretty similar to his old man. But whether he carries the flag in the same way, who knows? But I believe Katter's been in Parliament since like the 80s, like mid-late 80s. I mean, he's been around a long time.
Some ridiculous period of time, yeah. How old is that guy? He must be 100 years old now.
I think he's one of those guys. Actually, might look. So I'm interested. Just give me a sec.
Because he's one of those guys who, to me, looks like he could probably fight most people a quarter of his age until he turns 100, and then one day he'll just drop dead.
Yeah, it's like the meme of like the old man strength, like just like with this big shovel hand and a big thick arm, and just like break someone's skull because he's just a beast,
Yeah, it's sort of one of those guys. Like if you had to look at parliaments and say, all right, who would you fight? Who could you fight? He'd actually be one of the last people on the list, I reckon. I reckon he'd do most people.
Yeah. So if you gentlemen interested, I could sort of read a bit of his bio. I've just got his Wikipedia up. So Robert Bellarmine Carl Katter was born on the 22nd of May, 1945. So there you go. He's been around a while. Yeah. Here we go. Here's an interesting little anecdote. Katter attended the University of Queensland, where he studied law, but later dropped out without graduating. Whilst at university, Katter was president of the University of Queensland Law Society at St. Leo's College. As a university student, Katter pelted the Beatles with rotten eggs during their 1964 tour of Australia, declaring in a later meeting that the band he undertook this as an intellectual reaction against Beatlemania. Based.
Oh, no.
So he was a state politician from 1974 to 1992 and was elected to the seat of Kennedy, which is that North Queensland seat I was telling you about, in 1992, and has held his seat ever since.
Yeah, and he holds it by an enormous margin.
Yeah.
He's one of the most popular politicians in Australia. Yeah, he's a character, that guy.
Yeah. But it's typical Queensland. Like they create people like Bob Katter and Joe Bjelke-Peterson, who anyone who's interested in like politicians and individual characters, read about Joe Bjelke-Peterson. He has a remarkable man. But Queensland just has this knack of creating really, really sort of and also our own what's her name, Pauline Hanson's also a Queenslander from the seat of Oxley. Queensland just makes these people, there must be something in the water, but it's just fantastic. It actually makes our politics rather more colorful, because without them it'd be very bland.
Yeah, Queensland's an odd place, isn't it? Because since Joe, almost the entire time at the state level it's been ALP. It's quite strange. We think of Queensland as being really based, but I think they have a pretty high. They're up there in terms of the percentage of time that they've been under the
ALP governments. Yeah. And this is the problem which a lot of, for example, our friends in America probably the greatest exemplar of this would be, say, what Los Angeles does to and San Francisco do to California, or if we're talking one city, what Chicago does to Illinois. Like if you look at, say, the county breakups of voting in Illinois, like regional or like non-metropolitan Illinois is actually quite Republican, quite right-leaning, but Chicago's a complete shithole, right? As we know, and it obviously votes Democrat. Brisbane does the same thing in Queensland. Like if you go out into regional Queensland, you go to places like Cairns, like Townsville, like, Emerald, Roma, Gundawindi, sort of Toowoomba to an extent, right? These people are largely
pretty based.
They're pretty
in country groups.
Yeah, exactly. They're pretty based, pretty sort of parochial and sort of patriotic sort of people, right? But Brisbane is just this. It is like Chicago, right in the bottom of Queensland. And
but isn't
Queensland the state with the lowest percentage of its population in its capital city? Like I know for Victoria and South Australia and Western Australia, over 70% of Victorian, South Australians and Western Australians live in their capital cities. Queensland, I believe, is the most regional. It's only about 50% of people live in Brisbane, and yet they've had more time under a state government that's Labor than I think South Australia, Western Australia, if I remember correctly.
Well,
not sure about Victoria. I think Victoria.
Western Australia has actually been largely Liberal. Like I think, in my living memory, right? I think we've.
Well, it's not now.
Well, no, it's not now. But
they almost got wiped out, didn't they?
Well, exactly, yeah, and that's because of there's a whole bunch of reasons. Well, Perth's population has swelled, like even in my lifetime. Across our lifetime.
Like outside of Perth, Western Australia has very few cities, so it's like
we technically don't even have one.
Rural.
Yeah.
It's a pretty rural, and I think that's what the Franklin was saying about Queensland is that
it's a strange phenomenon.
Yeah.
Although these days, what they do with Brisbane is they bring in the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast, and they make Brisbane much bigger than it really is.
Sure, but it's a strange phenomenon that Queensland is the most regional state, and yet it's had so long under Labor governments. Whereas I think there must be at least one other state.
It's also got far north Queensland, which, like, when I first came to Australia, I thought, what was the FNQ? I had to ask people. But yeah, it like you're right, the Franklin. Like Brisbane is not this totally dominating city that Melbourne is in Victoria, for example,
or Adelaide or Perth. And actually, South Australia is kind of a weird one because they've got people from all over the map. They've got Green, they've got the hyphen, Sarah Hanson Young. They produced that Nick Xenophon. They've had Corey Bernardi was from, and I think at one point all three of those were in Parliament at the same time
in federal politics. At the same time. Yeah.
So that's weird, given that I think Adelaide is about 70 or 80% of South Australia. Like, there's pretty much nowhere outside of Adelaide. Like, it's all desert.
Would you guys?
Yeah, you've got Cooper Pedy.
Would you guys agree with me that, like, generally speaking, the most based and traditional Australians are not in big cities, but the country.
Yeah, sure.
That's where the real Australians are today. They're not in big.
Well, some in the outer suburbs, but
what people,
the problem is they're dying. They're a dying demographic. They're just being completely out displaced by A, migration, and B, the kind of people who are middle-aged, knockabout, what we might call dinky-die Australians, 20, 30, even 10 years ago. Like they're mostly sort of boomers now. I mean, the youngest people of that generation, or not, the youngest people of that kind of extraction might be late Gen Xers. But the thing is, it's just a demographic. Like, if you consider the types of people, we sort of have this mental picture of, Steve Irwin and, I know Paul Hogan is an actor, but like the kind of person Dundee represents in his movies, right?
Paint the Sydney Bridge, to be fair.
Well, exactly right. He was a before his Hollywood career, he was actually a tradesman and actually did work. And again, like the Les Hiddens types, who was the bush tucker man, like those men now are in their 60s and 70s, like they're elderly,
Yeah.
Because my dad's in his 70s. It's the same thing. Like,
and they're the real Aussies.
They're a dying breed, Yeah, exactly.
But they're the real Aussies.
They are the real Aussies.
Want them,
yeah. But instead, our cities are full of uni students and full of microbreweries serving IPA and bugmen with skinny arms and pot bellies. It's like, well, what are you going to do?
And blokes sitting on as the Franklin brilliantly says, blokes sitting on milk crates, big cold wind.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I didn't even have to write that line. That was written for me. And it was not written in a mocking tone. It was written as a, I don't know, mark of sophistication or something for people in Melbourne, sitting on milk crates with Antarctic winds at overpriced cafes.
100.
Yeah, but yeah, you're right that that demographic, it's on its way out, because even the younger people in rural areas are not like that. And the other thing is that I don't know if it's like this where you are, but certainly I've seen this in many country towns around Victoria. You've got the sort of the core of the country town that was built decades ago, and then just out the back of the town, they've built this new housing estate that looks like it could have just been plucked from a random part of Melbourne or Sydney.
Yeah.
And all these people, they're crammed into these tiny places now. These sort of dog box type affairs. And every country town in Victoria has these now, and they've had them for 20 years. And those are probably even the majority of places in a lot of towns in Victoria now. I'm not sure about other parts of Australia. So people, they supposedly they live in the countryside, but they live in a dog box. It's not even a quarter of an acre now. So they don't have the culture that goes with all of that of having space, basically, because they all live on top of each other.
Yeah. And
often they commute, and they'll commute from some place. They'll commute for an hour and a half to get to Melbourne or Sydney or wherever.
Yeah,
and the suburbs.
Like imagine living out there and then wanting to be in the rat race. Like I could think of nothing more idiotic. But anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
Andrew.
Yeah.
No. Look, the quarter-acre block used to be the Australian dream. You've got a quarter-acre block. You have a decent house with a decent garden. Your kids can play cricket in the garden and all this kind of stuff. And
hills high, it's nice patch of grass, a little bit of a garden, fruit trees. Yeah, it's all gone.
But now what they do is they build another house on their quarter-acre block, so the kids don't have any garden and can't play cricket anymore. So yeah, I look at these. I see it around me because I live about 50 k's out from Melbourne, and I see it around me. People do it all the time. They have this nice quarter-acre block, and instead of saying, "Okay, good, that's me done. My kids got a nice place," and in due course, I'll leave this place to my kids. They don't do that with another house on the quarter-acre block, so there's no garden.
Yeah,
a bit like Britain does all the time.
Yeah. And the worst thing is that, unlike Britain, we're not a small island. We actually have the space. And I mean, to some degree, you kind of end up, take a city such as Perth, for example, where we have where Perth has the surface area of roughly Los Angeles, with I think like a fifth of the population or less, or it's minuscule in comparison. Perth only hit 2 million.
A nicer climate.
And a nicer climate, and meanwhile, you sort of I've got an aunt of mine who lives out near Heidelberg, over in Melbourne there, up in the hills, it's really pretty up there. But again, like same thing, these big quarter-acre, third-acre, even half-acre blocks in some instances are just being chopped up and being used to build strata housing, and rather than sort of saying, oh well, you know what, I'll build a granny flat so that I can look after my mum and dad, and when they eventually pass away, I can hand something to my children. No, it's I'm going to make profit from the real estate market now, and my parents can stay in an old people's home and have their backsides wiped by migrant workers. Meanwhile, my child will have no hope of getting
100.
onto the property ladder because I'm going to put a second, I'm going to sort of like what they call it when you put like a second mortgage on your house, and increase my liquidity because the value's gone up. And it is a recipe for disaster. And there's a people who have no sense of legacy, no
100.
sense of like generational continuation, and they're just feeding the machine. Like property speculators thrive. If you have a relatively large block, or you live in an area that has large blocks, they just can't wait to rezone it and then chop it up and profit from it. I had a family friend, or like friends of my family who's like old, like the old man, like the dad ran a citrus sort of plantation, and when he was in his 20s and 30s, I mean the city was 20-30 kilometers away. By the time he was an old man, suburbia had not only reached him, but it had actually passed him. And he used to get offers, like I'm talking like eye-watering sums of money from developers, like, oh, because it was like a 10-acre, 15-acre property, which like in a city limit is quite large.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, like me and my wife are in our 80s and we're happy and it's fine and we just want to die here. And eventually they did. And then the children sort of decided, well, none of us are going to run the orchard, so we'll sell it to the developers. And eventually they sold, and obviously they would split the money, whatever.
Can just
but
about,
it's just the case of the fact that the old man was attached to it.
Yeah,
sorry,
no,
on,
look, I can just. No, I'm sorry, mate. I can just about walk to a dairy farm. Just about, I can walk to a dairy farm, but it's the last one in my area, and I'm quite sure it's going to get like someone else is going to take it over and turn it into a housing estate soon.
Yeah, the
money, it takes
the money
me
classes
25 minutes together.
The money classes cannot wait to get their grubby hands on like a square inch of real estate in a remotely lucrative position. And the thing is, until people actually just start saying, no, there's literally no amount of money that you could pay for this where I'll give it to you, they're just going to keep profiting off it, and in the end, like even though the developers would have paid a handsome sum, I don't know what the sum was, and I don't frankly care because it's not my business, right? Like that's, people have privacy for good reason. But the point being is that it would have been an eye-watering sum. But even then, by the time it was developed and bulldozed and flattened and subdivided and everything, they still would have made a killing on it. By the time they built the townhouses and sold it, they still would have made a killing. And who loses out? It's the people who can't get into the market. It's the same. Laissez-faire nonsense that they try and sell us. Or the market.
I mean, even so, you want to live somewhere, and like when you have little kids, it's like, I don't know if it's essential, but it's really important that you can take them to go and see cows. It's like it grows them up.
Yeah, and it's also nice for children to be cognizant of how systems work in a very basic sense.
Yep.
Like if mum and dad take a drive out to the countryside, it's like, oh, Lucy and Tommy, that's a cow. When you drink milk, when you buy milk at the shop, it comes from that cow. See the udders,
100,
the farmer will milk that cow and it'll go into a truck, and that truck will take it to a factory and put in bottles, and you buy that at the shop. Like, no, that's just too much for parents to do nowadays.
Yeah, no, 100. Look, I know the Franklin.
Sorry, gents, I'm kind of ranting now.
No, you're cool, mate. You're right. I know the Franklin runs like a small farm or a small holding.
Well, it's not a small farm. It's not commercial in any way.
But okay. So would you call it a small holding, the Franklin, or something like that?
I don't know. A hobby farm.
But I mean, you have animals. You have animals. You have some crops and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I actually need to go fairly soon before it gets dark, so I can put some chickens to bed.
Fair enough. I'm just thinking like it's good for modern people to have some link with the land, and I think that's what Furious was just saying. and we're just losing it, and we're even losing it in a country like Australia, which is enormous, although very heavily, the population is very heavily in cities.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a really great photo of one of my kids when he was really little in his pajamas, filling up a drinking trough for a cow, with a cow drinking from
Cool.
the trough. Yeah, and my kids are not sort of scared about grabbing chickens and putting them in a cage or what have you.
But
Yeah,
that's the great stuff kids need to learn. Like, for instance, when my sister and I were little on the farm, when my grandparents had chooks, like just sending them to go collect the eggs, like it's a nice little errand for them to have. They at a very young age develop this sense of responsibility, and you take feed down to the chooks, you take down the stripes, you send all the peels and the leftover food and whatever, and you chuck it in, and then the chooks lay the eggs, and then you take eggs back and give them a bit of a rinse, and you put them in the cool room, and that's a very nice thing for children to learn at a young age.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, I do need to make a move though before it gets dark.
All good, Franklin. Well, listen,
Yeah.
at least for myself,
Franklin,
it's wonderful that we
thank
managed to
you.
cross paths, mate. I'm glad you joined us. It's nice to
Yeah,
talk to you,
absolutely.
friend.
100%.
Thanks.
100%.
Nice to talk to you
The
too.
Franklin's YouTube channel is one of the best Australian YouTube channels. Go and subscribe to him.
Absolutely.
He's really good. Yeah. There
Thanks.
are 3 Australians I really like as YouTube people, and that's the Franklin, Furious, Pertinax, and Chris Scott. And I'm so happy that Franklin was on this stream. Excellent bloke.
Thanks
and
for having
also
me.
been all over the world, by the way.
Okay, well, I'll have to
Mate,
bid you all farewell.
you're always welcome. Yeah, happy
Thanks.
Australia Day, the Franklin.
Yeah, you too.
All right. No worries. Furious. Anything you wanted to shill?
Oh, not really much to shill. Like I said, whilst Mr. Majesty takes his well-deserved breaks, yeah, indeed, Franklin. Again, I want to reiterate. I'm glad he jumped on, because we've sort of been in sort of like these Venn diagram circles where they just brushed past each other. But Franklin and I have never spoken, so I'm glad that we have. He's a wonderful man.
The Franklin is a dude who academic agent should have on at some point.
Oh, doubtless. Yes, no, I agree.
He's really, really, really good Australian YouTuber. I've known the Franklin, I don't know, like 7, 8 years. Back in the day when he used to do stuff with Stardust.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, because Dave and Franklin used to talk to Stardust. Yeah.
Yep, and also he used to be, I think he still is mates with Dave the Distributors, who is another excellent YouTuber. So yeah, the Franklin is a really good man. A most underrated Australian YouTuber, in my opinion. Like, he does a monthly show, and in between he does other stuff. But yeah, the Franklin's great. I love him. He's an excellent man.
Yeah, no, very, very much the case. Yeah, no, so I suppose there's little left to say. Aside from, if I may perhaps offer a parting message, Mr. Iron Duke, what I will say is that I think Australia is in for tough times, and that's sort of a sentiment that I obviously expressed on the stream that we did with Semigog, with the wonderful Chris Gard and the wonderful Lady of Shalard. That although my personal predictions for Australia aren't good, I still think that if you are an Australian who lives in Australia, then do your utmost to sort of, how can I put this? Make sure that your immediate circle is as good and as wholesome as it can be, and insofar that you're able, create a sense of community around you, or at least try and find yourself in a position where community is possible with people who, at least to some degree, share a sense of feeling or a sense of belonging or a sense of like authentic Australian identity, and what's ahead for us will not be easy, and so do your utmost to not be demoralized. Try and set about your daily tasks and to fulfill a purpose in life without being browbeaten, because the moment we drop our heads and drop to our knees, these creatures win. So my message is to sort of to embrace the spirit of the bushman, of the digger, of the Anzac, of the Australian settler and frontiersman, and don't and be tough and tenacious in the face of adversity. So happy Australia Day,
look,
everyone.
I can't agree more with what you said there, Furious. Australia has a very harsh climate for the most part. Like there are bits along the east coast and a little bit on the west coast, which are less harsh. But in general terms, the vast majority of Australia has a pretty harsh climate, and only the best of men can make money from that climate.
And even if you take the money aside to build a
well.
life, Iron Duke,
Yep. Like, you're on a station somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and you might see your mates once a month, maybe. And there might be a big party twice a year. That used to be the way Australia ran. And I just find it funny.
Brews and,
Yep. Yeah, I used to find it funny because, you get your Crocodile Dundee and all this kind of stuff where all Aussies are these dudes who live in the outback or the top end. When Australia is the most, it's the most urbanized population in the world, actually, and has been for a long time. And yeah, Australians overseas, like, with the Australians who did the charge at Beersheba or the guys who were at Longtan and all the rest of it, they kind of absorbed this outback Aussie thing. You kind of absorbed it as a kid, I guess. I don't know. Like, love of my life was an Australian girl, Australian Sheila, who was lovely. And like, she once said to me, like, I asked her, what the fuck is a chiggy, babe? And she said, I'm a chiggy, babe. So, it's like, and she was.
That good old Australian vernacular, huh?
Yeah. Like, I love Australians. I think they're great people. But I'm an Englishman, and I will be until the last breath I ever draw. But I'm an Englishman who's an Aussie, so yeah.
And you may well be a Pole Iron Duke, but your addition to this country makes this country better, and I'm glad that you're here for what it's worth.
Well, thank you for that. I hope so. Like, I love Australians. I think they're good people. But and forgive me, guys, because this stream was half an hour late, and we didn't get Chris Gard because it was half an hour late, and obviously Chris was like so pissed he couldn't come on. But that's an Aussie thing. It's okay.
And also it's a case too, like if you have real life people who want you around and you're celebrating with people you care about, that should always be one's preeminent priority. So
100%, mate, 100%. And
but we held the fort, didn't we? Anyway,
Well, I hope we did. And Chris is almost a dad. Anyway.
Yes.
So like he's got to keep a very close eye on his missus.
Absolutely.
But yeah. But yeah, look, Australia ain't done yet. I know that the Franklin is very black-pilled on this. And I think we are too.
Mm-hmm.
But
Indeed.
we've not been destroyed yet. So, we some of us may hang on. And when the Kali Yuga turns into better times, maybe a few of us will still be hanging on. And things can return. You know,
Exactly. And if civilization tells you something, and actually I actually had an interesting back and forth. It was just me and academic Asian. We just sort of having a little chat amongst ourselves. Um, After he did a cigar stream with Philosophicat a couple of days ago, where they talked about like this evolving concept of like
I
of
watched that. Yeah, I
of
watched that.
of solar and lunar and of the Kali Yuga and these dramatic cycles that are sort of eons long, really far extending beyond our own notions of history. But if you sort of if one can conceptualize that in a historical context of our predecessors and the civilizations that we have produced on this earth, whether it's been the British Empire or the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Greek Empire, or even sort of neighboring Europe, we have the I mentioned them before, the Assyrians and the Sumerians, Egypt and Babylon and all these sort of things, all these places that you'd be surprised at the amount of times that civilizations will wax and wane and will be on the precipice of obliteration, and then will sort of come roaring back from the dead. Like for instance, imagine
100.
imagine being a Greek person who watched Mehmed II walk through the St. Romanus Gate when he took Constantinople in 1453. And even though Greece has suffered in the last 100 years with a number of tragedies, right? If you'd transported that Greek person to Athens in 1913, they probably wouldn't have believed you that their country would have been reborn from the ashes. If you had taken an ancient Egyptian from the period of Ramses who witnessed the marauding Hyksos and sea people that brought every civilization around Egypt to ruin. It destroyed the Hittites, it destroyed Ugarit, it destroyed the Phoenicians, it destroyed a bunch of people in that area. But then you took
The
that
whole
Egyptian
Bronze Age, basically.
to exactly the Bronze Age collapse. If you took that Egyptian to the Ptolemaic kingdom, or even to like just prior to when Alexander liberated it from Cyrus, from the Persians, from Darius, and the Egyptian would have thought, what, 5,000 years later we're still here. Humans have a tendency, even though
Alexander, am I right in saying Alexander used to sleep with a copy of the Iliad?
yes,
Always,
and he read it every day apparently.
Yeah,
and so
because he thought he was like maybe some sort of one of these demigods.
Yeah, or at the very least, sort of like the center point of a heroic epic, like sort of in the manner of Achilles, for instance, in many ways, Alexander was, and you look at his descendants, his successors. I mean, Antigonus, Demetrius, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Pyrrhos, none of them were small men. They all tried to emulate a great man. So I guess my message is, like, even though the ashes and the shadows of darkness seem imposing and terrifying, that you are not the first person to go through this, and that all that needs to exist is embers, and you'll be surprised what can roar back from the embers afterwards. So hold tight and buckle up and just persevere, hold dear to what matters to you, and endure. That's all I can say. Just make sure you have the strength and the resolve to do it.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that at all, man. Would you be up, may I ask you, Furious, for doing,
of course,
a series on?
I think you already know my answer, Duke.
Would you be up for doing a series on the Roman Empire? Because I reckon we could do a good series on the Roman Empire.
I would be delighted.
That would be really cool.
Yeah, indeed. No, I'd be more than happy to. I mean, in the end, we're in touch now. Whether you just DM me whatever ideas you want. I obviously I actually don't know when Mr. Majesty's coming back from holidays, but it obviously that is my priority, because he is my number
absolutely
one contributor.
That's fine.
But absolutely, Iron Duke, I'd be most pleased, because I mean, even though I do, for instance, have an interest in the Bronze Age, and I find Mesopotamian history interesting, and I love Byzantium, and the Crusader period interests me. And for anyone who's watched my stuff, I do love talking about the world wars. And Napoleon is interesting, even though I do have a few holes in my knowledge. But ultimately my bread and butter is classical Greece and Rome. So if you want to ever canvas that, it'd be my pleasure.
I just think, that like how this city in the middle of Italy took over the whole of the Mediterranean is
It's a hell of a
like
story, isn't it?
fascinating. It's a fascinating story.
it
And we
is.
have enough, luckily, we have enough history from the period that we kind of know what went
Yeah.
on. I wish there was a bit more, but we have enough to kind of know how that happened. And it's central to the whole of Western civilization, because without Rome, there would be no Western civilization, really.
Yeah, no, I agree that it would be wonderful. I'd be delighted to contribute to something. So, if you sort of formulate an idea as to how you want to go about it and the structure and
Well, I'm
maybe
just
like
thinking what
if you've got like a
we
time period and
I'm just thinking we might do an episode like, I don't know, once a month or twice a month, and like go from pretty much Republican Rome forward to Caesarian Rome and then the Empire, and just talk about how it happened.
yeah, even if we just have like a
'Cause
loose
it's
conversation,
weird.
yeah.
Yeah, it's
It
just
is.
like, if you look at it, this is okay. It became the biggest city in the ancient world with like 1 million inhabitants, which only London surpassed, I think, in the 18th century.
In Victorian
But
times, yeah.
yeah, but it was basically an average Italian middle of Italy city. And just from the strange things that happened to Romans and the strange way that they fought, it took over the whole of the Mediterranean and stood there for 500 years at least.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I've said this, I've said this before when we're talking about history, and I've said, we could very easily be talking about the Samnites in this way, or the Umbrians, or the Sabines, or the Oscans, or any number of peoples native to Italy. But what is it? What was this special source that sort of coursed through Roman veins, or or this sort of spark in their spirit that made the Romans what they were?
Self-belief,
and
if you ask
brought
me.
them to this ascendancy. You got to think they became firstly masters of Latium, and then masters of Italy, and then masters of the Western Mediterranean, and then Mare Nostrum, and then to the point where, well, you could argue that Rome was the only power that unified Europe. We added on bits, Asia Minor, North Africa, etc.
Oh, look, you could argue that the tragedy of Europe was that Rome never conquered Germany. I think you could argue that. If Rome had succeeded in Germany rather than getting that horrible thing where they lost
at
3 legions.
Yeah,
the Schutenberg forest. If they hadn't have had that and they had conquered all of Europe up to and including Germany, European history might have been a lot better, in my opinion.
European history may have been different, but and I say this to someone, as a descendant of those people. Like, I have a vested interest in the success of the Roman story arc, you might say. But to what degree are the German people fulfilling that role in the Evolian concept of being the energetic barbarians that resuscitate the embers? So you could always play the devil's advocate, you know what I mean? Food for thought.
Yeah, you
for
can,
when we talk
but
about
I'm not sure it works. It is. It's food for thought. I'm not sure I agree with it, though. Because what has Germany... I get in arguments with this about people who I am friends with. To what extent Germany has done good things in the last 150 years, I'm not quite sure. But, that's just me. I like my own view. Like, I think Italian fascism was not a terrible thing. I don't like it because I'm not a socialist, and like Italian fascism, as you all know, absolutely came from Marxists and socialists for the most part, including Mussolini. But Italian fascism, as it was, it didn't have any great hate groups. There were like loads of Jewish Italian fascists, for example. And if you were Jewish in Italy, you had no problem so long as the Italians were in Italy.
In fact, much of the Jewish bourgeoisie actually supported Mussolini and the fascists in the 20s and early 30s.
Yes, they did. Yeah, they did. There were loads of Italian fascists. And fine, like, because like, I think there's a little bit of truth in the JQ, but I think, especially in America, but I think it gets exaggerated by some people, shall we say?
Yes.
But on the other hand, like I said, like Italian fascism, which is what the Oswald Mosley British version was based on. Oswald Mosley was an El Duce fan. Like he liked Mussolini. He wasn't a Hitler fan. But Italian fascism wasn't even all that evil, you know. Like, it wasn't really. Like, they killed handfuls of people compared to the communists or almost anyone.
Well, in fairness, and I say this as someone who had an ancestor who actually fought in the Libyan pacification campaign under Graziani. The worst Italian atrocities.
There's a not very well known war.
Yeah. So, Libya is probably the worst atrocities that the regime committed. They weren't even in Europe. They weren't even against European people per se. It was actually in Libya against the forces under Omar Mukhtar and the Libyan resistance to Italian rule in North Africa.
Yeah.
Yes, Blackwood Bogan is a good man.
Italy under Mussolini, when it invaded Abyssinia, it had a pretty good reason, because the battle at Adua was like thousands of Italians were killed and tortured and, not good stuff. So kind of when Mussolini went back there and took the damn place over, I kind of understand why he did.
It was a scar and a stain that sort of sat in the Italian psyche that the Italians felt compelled to remedy, and they did. For better or for worse. And all nations have that in one way or another. The French and the Germans, the English and the French. The Poles and the Russians. It's a story as old as time. The Greeks and the Turks.
Oh, look, Isan Moana was like a bad defeat for Britain. So if you're going to look at this like in world history terms, you have to look at the Italian loss at Adua, I think in 1898.
Yeah. Just before the turn of the century. It's 1890 something. It's right at the end of the century.
Yeah, and like loads and loads of Italians were killed. Many of them tortured and then put to death, because like Abyssinia was not a civilized country. And so when like Mussolini said, okay, Italy's going to take over Abyssinia at this point in like 1937, 1938, there was a reason for it. And frankly, if I'd have been the Brits in those days, I'd have turned around and said, I don't care. Because Italian and British colonists in East Africa, on the border of Kenya and stuff, got on great. They had no problems.
Well, there's the thing too, and this is where sadly the Italian people and the British people sort of cultivated a rather unnecessary animosity, and the Italian perspective was always, well, if we conquer Abyssinia or Ethiopia, and we're uniting our holdings between Eritrea and Somaliland, which were Italian colonies, right? Ethiopia allowed them to be contiguous. It just seemed that because my grandfather used to talk about this all the time, and sort of the angst and the rage that the Italians felt for the British closing the Suez, and it's the papers at England printing, caricatures of Mussolini and the Italian fascist sort of goose stepping into Addis Ababa and lecturing the Italians on colonialism, whilst the British Empire literally had succeeded in establishing Cape to Cairo, which was a dream of Cecil Rhodes. And sadly, that sent both nations on a course to war. I'm just saying, like, it's a tragedy what then would unfold afterwards. And likewise, as we have since come to learn in our time, Mr. Iron Duke, the press, there's almost never a war that they haven't started that they wanted to start, and the press are largely to blame for that, amongst other groups of people, shall I say? But the press certainly no saints.
I totally agree with you, mate. And like the British and Italians were fighting each other in North Africa in World War II. In World War One, of course, the Italians were British allies.
Indeed.
But in World War II, we were fighting each other in North Africa. The story in Britain has come down. Italian soldiers were all useless and cowards, and they all surrendered. And that's not true. Like some Italians surrendered, just like some British surrendered. But on the whole, the good Italian divisions like the Bersaglieri and the Mountain troops and all these kind of
Alpini divisions and the
Alpini, they all fought really well, and even pretending that was true is actually like it's doing down the British soldiers who fought them, because these guys all surrendered, so the Brits fighting those guys had a really easy time. Not true. It's just not true. Even the Italian armored divisions sometimes, even though they didn't have great tanks, fought really quite well.
Indeed, that's true. And I mean, the thing is, I don't like to ever discount the what would you call it, the more disappointing aspects of that. Like, indeed, it's true that there are divisions who didn't fight well. There were divisions that didn't perform so well, that did surrender, particularly when I'm trying to think, was it O'Connor when he launched that reconnaissance force in Africa at the opening of the war in 41?
Oh yeah,
and the Italians just on their border forts there at I'm trying to think of the Sidi Barani and Forte Maddalena.
But O'Connor had Matilda 2 tanks, and no Italian anti-tank gun could kill a Matilda tank. So
yeah.
You can kind
it wasn't
of
hopeless.
Out
yeah.
And like one of the Italian generals was like literally killed coming out of his headquarters and firing a submachine gun at the Brits.
Yeah, I actually know who the general is. I've just gone blank on who it is. I know he served under Graziani. I remember my grandfather talking about this because he actually wasn't in Africa back then. He got sent to Africa in 42. Like when the Africa Corps got deployed, like with Rommel, and he was sent over with the was it the 7th Panzer, I think, and the German 21st Light Division.
Yeah, 21st, and then the 5th, and absolutely.
Yeah, and then the Italians sent reinforcements as well, which of my grandfather was a part of. So he actually wasn't there at the start of the war. But he obviously knows the circumstances which he got sent into, and that's the stuff he sort of told me about. But actually, can I just answer a question?
But like a general who comes out of his HQ.
Firing a submachine gun,
submachine gun
Chad
from his hip, and gets killed. Chad. That's a Chad. Yeah.
Can you just
what
bring
are you
up
slagging him off for?
Exactly. Can you just bring up military theorist's comment? I'll answer it if you'd like me to, just because it happens to be the end of the stream and it's slightly pertaining. Yeah. So my dad had a great uncle. He was an Alpino, and he was actually quite remarkable because most of my family, like mid 5 foot something. This uncle of my dad was 6'3", so he was a monster compared to the rest of the family. And he was actually an Alpino, and he fought on the Eastern Front in World War II. And there's a little known battle called the Battle of Nikolaevka, in which, and what's interesting about this is that no, the Italian Alpini weren't sent to fight in the Caucasus, which I agree, military theorist, is odd. But the Italian Eighth Army was actually deployed north to face to protect Sixth Army's flank, which, for those who obviously know, Sixth Army was the German army that was entangled in Stalingrad and eventually got trapped there with elements of the Fourth Panzer Army. But the Italian Eighth Army was facing north alongside. I think it was between the Romanians and the Hungarians, if my memory serves me right. And when the Soviets launched Operation Uranus and completely broke the flanks of the Axis forces shielding the Sixth Army and then trapped it in the encirclement, a small pocket, or I say small pocket, a pocket of Italian troops, basically equivalent of a corps of the Italian army, got trapped in the encirclement. And it was one of the very few formations that fought its way out. And it was, I'm pretty sure there was 3, I think it was I remember the Tridentina being a part of it and possibly the Cunese division. And I can't remember the 3rd division, but there was 3 Alpini divisions as part of that formation. And they actually fought their way out of the encirclement. And by the end of it, the general who commanded the corps had been killed. And a general by the name of Reverbi took command afterwards. And Nikolaevka was the last village before the Italians broke out. And the Italian general, Reverbi, jumped in the tank and actually ordered the troops forward and basically like YOLO'd into the village. And the Alpini suffered horrible casualties to actually take this village because they were desperate. If they did not take Nikolaevka, they would be trapped. And so the Italians attacked all afternoon and eventually broke the Soviets on like just before sundown. And the few Hungarian, Romanian, and even German troops that were sort of a part of the column broke out of the encirclement. And now some of the very few troops to escape the encirclement out of Operation Uranus. And my dad's uncle was actually a member of one of those Alpini divisions. I don't know which, but I know he was there. And yeah, again, like most events on the Eastern Front, the things that the men talk about that they witnessed stuck with them forever. It was horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, the Italian Alpini were the Italian mountain troops because, Italy in the north has a load of mountains. The other really good soldiers of the Italians were the Bersaglieri, which were their light troops. I think this probably
light and assault troops, depending on their armaments, because Bersaglieri were either used in, say, like, it's sort of in the same way. You know how the Germans, and I would believe the British would have done similar, but you know how the Germans really embrace motorcycle reconnaissance.
They're kind of like rifle
light
troops,
armored cars. Well, this is the thing. So
yeah.
Bersaglieri would either be like lightly armed reconnaissance troops, with armored cars, or as the Brits famously use, the Bren carriers, like that kind of thing, or motorcycles. Or Bersaglieri would be sort of, what they would do with them is a bit like how when the Germans had to economize at the end of the war, or in the later years of the war, and they created the Volksgrenadier division, and which ended up being like a binary division. So they were sort of trying to make the division smaller, but they'd compensate for firepower by increasing the number of submachine guns and machine gun teams, and really making it a high firepower force for the number of troops that they had, right? Because obviously taking out a regiment weakens the division, right? Because it's a binary division rather than a triangular division.
Yes.
And so the Bersaglieri was sort of armed in a very similar way of, use the shock troops in that kind of same way of, a lot of submachine guns, because the Italians had I think it was the Breda, the Modello 38, I think was their submachine gun that they used. And, a large number of machine guns, which the Italians didn't have a lot of.
They had very good
Germans,
armored cars. Italy had the best armored cars in 40 and 41.
Yes. Well, probably after the Germans, but the problem is the Italians couldn't keep pace, and then eventually, like the Americans, when they converted the Stuart to a light tank, and what's the one the British used? I'm trying to think of the. I think it was like a
we mostly used Stuarts, but then in 44,
I'm thinking of the Tetrarch, actually.
which had a 7mm shotgun.
Yeah, and
Oh,
also you could
okay.
the
The
Tetrarch, right?
Tetrarch was not used much.
Okay.
Yeah, but it wasn't
but-
used much. I mean, it was
but either way,
airborne
yeah.
thing.
Yeah. But either way, you had these light vehicles which were very good in that reconnaissance role and ended up being sort of superior to what the Italians had by that point. But yeah, so that was the two sort of functions of the Bersaglieri was sort of, you know, that light, you know, reconnaissance role, and then also high volume firepower sort of shock troops. Yeah, the bread. If you actually watched, trying to think that American bloke with that, is it Forgotten Weapons or whatever it is, that channel. His name's Ian.
Yeah,
He basically says that the
weapons.
yeah,
I love it.
yeah, basically Ian says that the Modello 38, which is the model 38, is one of the best submachine guns he's ever fired. It was and the original model, not the ones that they built after, and they had to like shortcut it and make it cheaper to produce. But the original 38 was a very, very good submachine gun, probably up there, you know, with, I mean, the iconic submachine guns of World War II. You think of the Russian PPSH or the German MP40, the US Grease gun. You guys had the Sten gun. I mean, there's a lot of these weapons are sonic now. Like those of us who watched Hollywood movies or we play Call of Duty, you know, we know these weapons back to front. But Eindrich,
the
listen,
Sten was a piece of shit, by the way. And
well,
my
it was a piece of
grandma
shit,
used to make them. Yeah, but my grandma
was she in the
used to make
factory?
them.
Was she?
So, yeah, she worked in.
Oh, there you go.
And made them. But they were shit. They really were. The Sterling was an excellent submachine gun, but that was
I actually
like
meant to say the Sterlings. I know
War
the
II.
Sten was crap, but I just couldn't think. Yeah. Oh, was the Sterling just after World War II? I didn't realize.
Yeah, it was just after World War II. Whereas the Australians had these top-feeding submachine guns, and both of them were really good.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, the Finnish SMG, the Suomi, I think it was called, which was basically like the Russian PPSH but better. Yeah.
And like I said, the Australians had the ON gun, and then they had the Austin after that, and they were pretty like the ON was like almost like a top feeding Sten, and the Austin was a top feeding Sterling, and both of those were excellent. They were really good guns. And thank you to Arminius who
filled us in there. Yeah, and it's interesting too that actually, it's probably fair that we end on the note because we've been talking about the Italians for a while now. You've been trying to get a buzz out of me talking about Italians, but we should end on an Australian note. But what's interesting about Australian weapons is that if you sort of consider where they fought, you know, in the latter part of the war, which was obviously sort of in the Pacific theater against the Japanese, you know, through New Guinea and the Malay and Burma and wherever, right? Is that the Australians made very good use of the British, you know, the Bren gun, the top feeding submachine, the top feeding machine gun, right? Which was very good for its, you know, it's a designed intended purpose. And then the Japanese inversely also had a top feeding machine gun, which I believe was a Type 11. So sort of funny that the last two top feeding machine gun designs were both sort of used against each other in the Pacific, one by Imperial Japan and then the other by Australia and British Commonwealth forces in the South Pacific. So there you go.
Well, people may say, including myself, that I've been talking to you about the Italians in World War II. I haven't been doing that on purpose. I just
we got here by accident, we swear.
Yeah, I just love military history, you know. And there's some great Italian military history. So, you know, I mean, the Italians were in the Crimean War in 1855, for God's sake. So
it's actually the first time the Bersaglieri were deployed overseas.
Yeah, I think so. They're the guys with the big. What are the plumes they wear in their helmets?
Yeah, actually, I'd have to ask my my mum because her dad was a Bersaglieri in the war. I'm trying to think what bird it is, but yeah, it's like a big black plume that they have over their hats. Yeah.
Yes, they do. Yeah, and if you go and look on YouTube, you can find Bersaglieri And because they're light infantry, they do these really quick marches where they're actually running, a bit like the British Rifle Brigade and stuff like that. So yeah, go and check it. It's cool.
And the other thing is too is that they actually, funnily enough, the Bersaglieri actually, even during World War II, had among the highest physical or the requirements for the war, full stop, for infantrymen across any side of the war. They had some of the highest athletic and marksmanship baseline sort of, credentials that if you didn't meet them, you weren't accepted into the Bersaglieri. So to actually be able to become a Bersaglieri, you had to be very competent at shooting. You had to be very fit. And my mum always tells stories of when my grandfather was in the Bersaglieri. He was, and like you say, the march is actually really interesting because they're always high tempo. And Bersaglieri were basically famed for never slow marching or never walking. They always like cantered everywhere, if I could use that, or jogged. Always did everything at high tempo. And hence, if you go to Google and search like any Bersaglieri march, Marcia della Bersaglieri or Tocco della Bersaglieri or whatever, whatever you enter into YouTube, you'll always find that their marches are very high tempo and very quick, more so than most marches because of that.
Oh, 100. And last thing I wanted to bring up on this stream. Indeed. If you ever like The Sopranos, the series, which is way, way better than The Sopranos, is the Italian crime series. What's it called?
Gomorrah.
Yeah, Gomorrah. That series, which is 5 seasons and about 48 episodes, all of it is really good. Like a couple of days ago, I watched the spin-off movie they made in 2019 about the dude who's one of the main characters, who's called The Immortal. That's also very good. Yeah, go and watch that, guys.
And on that basis,
it's not at all like woke,
or
anything like that.
It's actually very visceral, and very gritty, and almost horrific at times. Yeah,
some of it is pretty horrific. Yeah.
I have to say, Iron Duke, if you do like Gomorrah, I have to give you another recommendation because you might not have heard. It's even more obscure than Gomorrah. Have you ever heard of a show by the name of Romanzo Criminale?
I'll certainly look it up. Can you?
I'll send it to you a DM. I'll DM it to you.
Yeah.
But if you like Gomorrah,
DM it to me, please.
You will most certainly like this show. It's very because I sort of remember like my like like my grandparents and like their generation talking about like this crime wave back in the 70s and 80s, and it actually addresses that in the show. So I've just sent it to you in the DM, and you can check it out.
Ah, cool, man. I love that. Please do.
No,
go and look up. If you're a fan of The Sopranos, go and check out Gomorrah. It's like 1,000,000 times better, and it's really tough, and it's not even slightly woke. It's a good Italian series.
I actually misread Albert the Pike's comment. He says Ichi Scutum, and I mistook it for Ichi something else. I had to double check what he was saying. I thought he said Ichi Scutum for a second. But anyway, God, we could chew the fat about Italy till midnight. So maybe it's best we I was gonna say it's getting late where you are, Iron Duke, so we probably best
it is. It's 9:31 p.m. Those
wrap things up.
Yeah. I must apologize to Chris Scott because like this was late, and I'm sorry. My internet was fucked. Sorry, Chris. Thank you very much, Furious, and thank you very much to Franklin for joining us on this stream. I was lucky you dudes turned up, or it would have been a disaster.
Well, it just so happens that we actually surfaced within 10 minutes of each other. So no, it was good. It was a nice, cozy stream. Glad the audience liked it. Sorry that with my presence it inevitably became Romanized and Italianized. I'm deeply sorry for having done that to an Australian Day stream, but it's been good fun. And Iron Duke, I've had an absolute ball. Thank you for having me on your channel. Most kind of you. This was long overdue, but I'm glad we've done it. And most certainly this year, if we're either going to stream about Italy in World War II or about the Romans, in either case, or indeed both cases, I would be delighted.
Yeah, look, mate, we'll do a Roman Empire stream. I'm pretty certain.
So, Tomb of Arminius, Dago hijacked the stream. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Bloody wogs coming to this country and just taking everything. Sorry.
Yeah,
right.
That's not really fair, mate. Your family are farmers, and you do it hard sometimes. So yeah, all right.
All in good faith.
Later,
thank
guys.
You so much, Iron Duke. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you to the chat. Thank you everyone for coming along. And until next time, thank you so much.
Absolutely, 100%. Go well, guys. And I'm sorry, Chris God, that I was a bit late. You didn't see the stream, because this would have even been better if you'd have joined. Check you later, guys.
Next year we'll do it.
Yeah, we will.